The lectures on these tapes are titled The New Testament, Part 1. The lecturer is Professor Bart Ehrman. Professor Ehrman is the Bowdoin and Gordon Gray Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He received his BA from Wheaton College and went on to earn his master's and doctorate from Princeton Theological Seminary. Professor Ehrman taught at Rutgers for 4 years before moving to UNC in 1988. During his tenure at UNC, he has earned numerous awards and prizes, including the Students Undergraduate Teaching Award, the Ruth and Philip Heddleman Prize for Artistic and Scholarly Achievement, and now the Bowman and Gordon Gray Award for Excellence in Teaching. With a focus on early Christianity in its Greco-Roman environment and a special expertise in the textual criticism of the New Testament, Professor Ehrman has published dozens of book reviews and over 20 scholarly articles for academic journals. He has also authored or edited 8 books, including The New Testament, A Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings. Each of Professor Ehrman's lectures is outlined in the course guide that comes with these tapes. The course guide also includes a glossary, timeline, biographical notes, and bibliography. You may find it useful to review the outlines before and after listening to the lectures.
I'd like to welcome you to this course on the New Testament. I'm Bart Ehrman, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I've been teaching courses on the New Testament and early Christianity for the past 11 years. I've been engaged in the academic study of the New Testament for 25 years, and I must say that even though my views of the New Testament have changed rather drastically since I was a student in college, my fascination for this book has never waned. The New Testament is probably the most revered and the most unknown book in our culture. This course of lectures is designed for people who want to learn something about it. Both people who don't know a lot about the New Testament but think that it's time that they did, and people who have studied the New Testament but want to see what an academic approach to the New Testament might look like. In this opening lecture, I'd like to explain why a study of this kind is worth our while, and also explain how we'll approach the New Testament, indicate what our objectives will be, and provide a few of the major points of background that are necessary to the beginning phases of our study. So, why is it important to engage in this kind of study? Virtually all modern historians would agree that the New Testament has been the most significant book in the history of Western civilization. It lies at the root of our form of culture, and it continues to be an object of reverence and inspiration for millions of Christians today. A book that governs people's personal lives, that shapes their religious views, that provides them with a sense of hope. If you want to understand our culture, you have to know something about the New Testament. This is true for what we might call high culture as well as low. You simply can't read English literature from Old English classics like Beowulf and The Dream of the Rood up through the 20th century without understanding the imagery drawn from the New Testament. The same can be said, of course, about Western visual art. In addition, the New Testament plays an enormous role in our political and social lives. Whether we like it or not, it's appealed to by the White House and by the U.S. Senate when trying to debate issues of foreign and domestic policy. It's used on both sides by people advocating their views on nuclear disarmament and abortion. And it's been invoked to support causes over the years that most people today would consider to be highly dubious morally: slavery in the South, military intervention abroad, the oppression of women everywhere. Obviously, despite its importance, the New Testament is a book whose meaning is not self-evident. This is perhaps most obviously seen simply on the denominational level. The difference between Greek Orthodox priests, Appalachian snake handlers, mainline Presbyterians, and serious Pentecostals are not related just to geography, culture, and history. They're also related to different understandings of the New Testament. In sum, the New Testament has brought a world of good into our civilization through its teachings of love and its promises of hope. And it's been used to promote evil in a wide range of hideous guises. For all these reasons, this book is worth our serious and sustained attention, whether we happen to believe in it or not. How, though, should we go about studying it? There are, in fact, several ways that we could approach the study of the New Testament in this course. We could, in theory, approach it from the perspective of the faithful believer, wanting to learn what it says in order to know ourselves what we should believe and how we should act. This kind of approach would probably be appropriate if we were in a church or in a Sunday school, and it would probably be appropriate if we were in a private Christian college. Where I teach, though, at a state university, this is not really an appropriate approach, since I'm not allowed constitutionally, at least as I understand the Constitution, to embrace a particular religious point of view when teaching my students about religion. Also, for this kind of course that we're doing here, the intention is to introduce the New Testament for all people, not simply for people who happen to be believers. Moreover, I think that there are other equally valid ways of approaching the New Testament that don't require us either to agree about religion among ourselves or even to agree to believe or disbelieve in the New Testament. It's possible, in fact, to study the book not from the religious perspective of those who believe, but from a cultural perspective of one who's interested in the development of Western civilization. And so this would be a second way to approach the study of the New Testament culturally. There can be little question that this book stands at the foundation of civilization as we know it. Whatever you happen to think about Christianity yourself, whether you're an ardent Roman Catholic, a strong evangelical, a mainline Methodist, a hardcore atheist, an absolute pagan, there can be no question that the Christian church, since the 4th century, has been the most significant social, economic, political, and cultural force in Western civilization. And the foundation of the church was and is the New Testament. So we could see how the New Testament has been used through the ages, for example, during the Crusades, or the Inquisition, or the Protestant Reformation. Or we could study how it has played such a huge role in Western art or in English literature. As interesting as this kind of study may be, it also will not be the approach that we'll be taking during this course. For there's yet another way to approach the New Testament, one that will, as a side benefit, elucidate both the modern debates over the meaning of this book and the nature of its historical impact on Western civilization. This other way of approaching it has its more direct concern with understanding the New Testament in its own historical context. This approach involves studying the New Testament, then, from the perspective not of the believer, not of the cultural historian, but of the ancient historian. This is the approach that we'll be taking in this class. To approach the New Testament from the historical perspective means suspending our own belief or disbelief in its teachings and working to understand how the 27 books that now make up the New Testament canon came into being, to see who wrote them and why, and to determine what they might have meant to their original readers. These are the sorts of questions that will absorb us in our subsequent lectures. There are several pieces of important background information on the New Testament that we need to consider here in this first lecture before plunging into our study. One of the things that I'm surprised about continually is how little people know about the New Testament just in terms of its basic facts. This realization comes to me every year when I teach my large undergraduate course at Chapel Hill. This is a class with about 350 students in it, and every year I begin by giving a pop quiz in which I ask students some basic information about the New Testament. Questions like, how many books are in the New Testament? What language were these books written in? When were these books written? I also throw in some curveballs. I ask them who wrote the book of 1 Peter, who wrote the book of 1 Timothy, and who wrote the book of 1 Andrew. It's a curveball because, of course, there is no 1 Andrew in the New Testament, but most of my students don't realize this. There are 11 questions on this pop quiz that I give to my students, and I tell them that if anybody gets 9 out of the 11 right, I'll buy them a Mexican dinner at a local Tex-Mex restaurant. In my 11 years of teaching, I have classes every year of 350 students. In my 11 years of teaching, I've had only one student who's gotten 9 out of 11 answers right of these very basic questions of background. And I'm afraid, even though they're just 19 and 20-year-olds, I'm afraid that their lack of knowledge, in fact, is typical rather than atypical of the population at large. And so I think I should here give some basic background information so that we're all on the same page about what the New Testament is all about in terms of its basic information about it. As I've already indicated, there are 27 books in the New Testament. All of these books were originally written in Greek. There are some scholars who think that some of these books may have originally been written in Aramaic, but that's by far a minority opinion. These books, in the judgment of almost everybody who works on them, were originally written in Greek. That's one of the interesting things about my students is every time I ask them this question, fully half of my students think that the New Testament was written in Hebrew, which has always struck me as odd. I've never quite understood it, but I suppose it's because they've seen enough TV shows on the Bible where they flash up screens with Hebrew text that they associate Hebrew with the Bible for some reason. The New Testament books were written in Greek, even though the books of the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures were written in Hebrew. The books of the New Testament were all written from during the 1st century A.D. or shortly thereafter. Most scholars would date the books of the New Testament from between the year 50 of the Common Era, 50 A.D., up to about 120 A.D. To put that in perspective, virtually everybody thinks Jesus was born sometime around 4 B.C. and was probably executed sometime around the year 30 A.D. And so the books of the New Testament began to be written about 20 or 25 years after that, and then continued to be written until about the year 120 A.D. These are the earliest surviving books that we have from the Christians. There were other books written by Christians at the same time that have no longer survived, and there are some books written by Christians that were written near the end of the writing of the New Testament books that still do survive, but that did not make it into the New Testament. Later on in this lecture, I'll say a few words about how Christians have decided which books to put into the New Testament and which ones not to put in. I should say, again by way of background, that Jesus himself did not write any of the books of the New Testament, and so far as we know, did not write anything. We don't know whether Jesus himself was able to write or not, but it is pretty clear that he didn't produce anything that has survived. Instead, the books of the New Testament are written by followers of Jesus. Some of the books are attributed to Jesus' own disciples. The word disciple is comes from a word which means follower. The disciples were earthly followers of Jesus, and sometimes the word disciple is used in a technical sense to refer to one of Jesus' 12, one of the 12 men whom Jesus picked in order to be his disciples on earth. Some of the books of the New Testament are attributed to some of the disciples. For example, among our Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John are allegedly disciples of Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector who is referred to as one of Jesus' disciples. John is thought to be a person known as the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. I should say at this point, as I'll point out in greater detail later in a later lecture, that these books themselves don't actually claim to be written by Matthew and John. In your English Bibles today, you'll see a title, The Gospel According to Matthew, but that's not the original title to this book. The author himself didn't say, this is the Gospel according to Matthew. Of course, if he were writing the book, he wouldn't say, this is Matthew's Gospel. He would simply say, this is the Gospel, or he'd say, this is the Gospel of Jesus, or something. He wouldn't say, this is the Gospel of Matthew. This is an attribution of the book to Matthew by somebody living later. In fact, this attribution first came about in the 2nd century. So that two of the books, two of the Gospels, are attributed to Matthew and John, even though they don't claim themselves to be written by Matthew and John. These are two of the disciples. Other books of the New Testament explicitly do claim to be written by people who were apostles. Now, the word disciple means a follower of Jesus. The word apostle comes from the Greek word which means one who is sent. An apostle is somebody who understands him or herself to have been sent on a mission. And so there could have been, and there were, early Christians who understood themselves to have been sent by Jesus on a mission to spread his good news throughout the world. This would include, for example, the apostle Paul. Paul was not one of the original followers of Jesus. He was not a disciple, but he did understand himself to have been an apostle. And we'll study Paul at some length in this course because 13 of our 27 books actually claim to be written by Paul. And so Paul, of course, is a very significant figure for the history of Christianity, but also especially for our understanding of the New Testament itself. We'll also see that scholars have come to dispute whether Paul actually did write these books that are attributed to him. 13 books claim to be written by him, but scholars have reasons for doubting whether all 13 actually were written by Paul or not. We'll see this later in the course. And so in the New Testament, we have 27 books written in Greek from the 1st century, the books attributed to disciples or claiming to be written by apostles. These 27 books of the New Testament can be organized into 4 major groupings. The first major group would be the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 4 Gospels are the only books that we have in the New Testament that actually describe the life, activities, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Any stories that you've heard about Jesus that sound at all plausible historically come from these 4 books. Probably every story you've ever heard, any teaching of Jesus that's found in the New Testament, any activity of Jesus, any of his miracles, they're found in these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's surprising, as we'll see later in this course, that the other books of the New Testament say virtually nothing about Jesus' life itself. The stories of his life are found in these 4 books. Since they narrate Jesus' life from his birth to his death, these 4 Gospels can be seen as narrating the beginnings of Christianity, and so appropriately they occur at the beginning of the book of the New Testament. The second division of the New Testament consists of only one book, the book of Acts, or sometimes called the Acts of the Apostles. This is a historical account of the activities of Jesus' apostles and his missionaries after Jesus himself had died. It's concerned then with how these followers of Jesus propagated the faith as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire. The book begins after Jesus' death and resurrection. It narrates his ascension into heaven, and then it shows how the apostles were empowered to spread his gospel throughout the world. And so it's not about Jesus so much as about his apostles, and it's called the book of Acts. Rather than dealing with the beginnings of Christianity as the Gospels, then, the second category of book deals with the spread of Christianity. The third group of books in the New Testament are the 21 epistles, or letters. These 21 epistles or letters are actual pieces of correspondence sent by early Christian leaders to other individuals or other communities. Of these 21 epistles, 13, as I've indicated, are attributed to the Apostle Paul. The others are attributed to others of the apostles, including James and Peter and John. These letters are written to address problems that had emerged in various Christian communities. Problems having to do with what Christians ought to believe, how Christians ought to behave. Rather than dealing with the beginnings of Christianity in the life of Jesus or the spread of Christianity through the Acts of the Apostles, these 21 books are more centrally focused on the beliefs and ethics of Christianity and are regularly turned to by Christians who want to know what ancient Christian beliefs were, doctrine and ethics. The fourth part of the New Testament again consists of a single book, the book that probably is the source of most fascination by Christians still today, the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is an apocalypse. In other words, it's a book which narrates events that are going to transpire at the end of time, when God brings all of his promises to fulfillment by destroying this world and bringing in a utopian kingdom. It's an amazing book, the book of Revelation. It's quite unlike anything that most of us ever read. Probably the closest thing to it that we read would be science fiction novels, because it deals with sort of a supra-mundane reality, which can explain the reality here on earth, in which the prophet actually ascends to another world and has encounters with supernatural beings and learns about the fate of earth. This book of Revelation, then, rather than dealing with the beginnings of Christianity or the spread of Christianity or the ethics and beliefs of Christianity, deals with the culmination of Christianity at the end of the age, when God intervenes on behalf of his people. These, then, are the four major categories of books within the New Testament. I've already indicated that these 27 books found in the New Testament were not the only books written by the early Christians. They were simply the books that later Christians decided to include in their sacred canon of Scripture. The word canon comes from a Greek term which literally refers to a straight edge or a measuring rod. It came to be used to refer to a collection of books that would provide a kind of it would show the measure of a corpus of literature, the extent of a given body of authoritative texts. And so you can have a canon of any kind of literature, a canon of Shakespeare, for example, or a canon of the Hebrew Bible. The canon of the New Testament are the 27 books that Christians at later times decided were sacred books. One of the hardest things for my students at the undergraduate level to understand and to conceptualize is the fact that the 27 books of the New Testament were not always considered to be books of Scripture. Even though today you can go to any bookstore and buy a New Testament and you'll get the same 27 books in the same sequence, it wasn't always that way. In fact, there were long and hard debates about which books should be included within the canon of Scripture. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd and even 4th centuries, Christians debated about the status, the canonical status of books that had been written in the 1st century. And as I've indicated, we have some of these other books that now survive, books that make for very interesting reading. For example, we have other Gospels that are not found in the New Testament that also record Jesus' words and deeds. Probably the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century for the New Testament was the discovery of one of these other Gospels that people commonly know about today, thanks to this discovery, a Gospel called the Gospel of Thomas, that some scholars have touted as the fifth Gospel. Gospel of Thomas is a very interesting book, and we'll say some more about it later in the course. It's a book that consists of 114 sayings of Jesus, some of which sound like the sayings of Jesus in the New Testament Gospels, but other sayings that in fact are quite unlike the sayings of the New Testament. Some of these sayings sound like Gnostic teachings. Gnostic coming from the Greek word gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S, gnosis, which refers to knowledge. These teachings of Jesus seem to presuppose a worldview that says that Jesus was a divine redeemer who came down from heaven to reveal the truth that would set people free from the prison of this material world. Some of the sayings in this gospel sound very strange to our ears today. One reason they sound so strange, though, is because we're not used to them, because this gospel didn't make it into the New Testament. There were other Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament that we've known about for a much longer time. For example, the Gospel of Peter. This is a book that actually claims to be written by Simon Peter, Jesus' own disciple. We didn't have access to this book until it was discovered at the end of the 19th century. One of the reasons it's so interesting is because in this Gospel we have a narration of Jesus' resurrection itself. In the New Testament we have accounts of Jesus having been raised from the dead. We don't have any narration of him actually emerging from the tomb. The Gospel of Peter, though, does give a narration of this event, a fantastic account in which we're told that two angels came down from heaven and entered into Jesus' tomb, and there emerged from the tomb three individuals, two with their heads reaching up to heaven, and one whose head reached up above the heavens. And behind the three, there emerges a cross from the tomb. A voice comes from heaven and says, "Have you preached to those who have fallen asleep?" Meaning those who have died. And the cross replies, "Yes." A terrifically interesting account that some Christians thought belonged in the New Testament, but eventually it was excluded. We have a number of books, Gospels, Acts, Epistles, Apocalypses, which claim to be written by apostles and disciples that did not get included. It was not until the 4th century AD that Christians came up with our list of 27 books. The first person to come up with the list that we have now was a bishop from the city of Alexandria, Egypt, a bishop who was named Athanasius, a very powerful figure in early Christianity, who in the year 367 AD wrote a letter to his churches indicating, among other things, which books should be read as part of their worship services. He listed our 27 books. This is the first time that any Christian that we know of thought that these books and no others should be part of the Christian Scriptures. Note the date, 367. This is 300 years after most of these books had been written. 300 years later, finally somebody decides these and only these should be among the books. And even then the issue wasn't decided because Christians continued to debate for decades which books should be included until finally everybody pretty much agreed on these 27 books. The debates ranged over a number of issues. Christians by and large thought that books could be included in the list only if they were written by apostles or by companions of the apostles. Books could be included only, therefore, if they were very ancient, close to the time of Jesus. If a book had just been written recently, even if it's a very good book, it couldn't be included in the canon of Scripture. Third, books had to be books that were widely read throughout Christendom. They couldn't just have appeal in just one locality. They needed to have widespread appeal to show that in fact, they were books that were widely thought to have sacred authority. And fourth, most importantly, books that were to be included in the Scriptures were books that had a correct teaching about doctrine. The teachings had to coincide with the teachings of the church at large. Probably the reason that books like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter, were excluded was precisely because these books were not thought to be orthodox or correct in their teaching. I want to stress that the question about whether these books really were written by apostles or really were ancient, those are historical questions, not theological questions. They have to be decided on the basis of historical evidence. That is the approach that we are going to be taking in this course. Not asking whether theologically it makes sense that yes, Matthew really wrote Matthew or Paul really wrote the book of Galatians. We're not going to be asking that question from a theological point of view, but from a historical point of view. I am not going to be trying to promote either belief or disbelief in these books. I'll not be taking a religious point of view. I'll be taking a historical point of view, discussing what these books say, what their perspectives are, who wrote them, in what circumstances, for what audiences, and for what reasons. This, then, will be a historical approach to the New Testament. In conclusion, the books of the New Testament are major religious, cultural, historical artifacts, and they merit our careful attention whether or not we happen to be Christian believers in these books. The 27 books of the New Testament are our earliest surviving documents that come from the early Christians for the most part. These books, many of them which claim to be written by Jesus' own apostles, came to be regarded as sacred scripture by Christians. In this course, we will be studying these books for what they can tell us about Jesus and his followers from the first century, and we'll be approaching them from a strictly historical perspective. We'll begin our study then in the next lecture by considering the historical context within which these books were written. Because for a historical approach to the New Testament, the only way to understand them is to situate them within their own historical context. In our last lecture, I showed that the New Testament consists of 27 books that were written by the earliest Christians. These books were later formed into a canon of Scripture. By the 4th century, Christians were thinking that these books consisted of sacred books that were inspired to provide information for Christians about what to believe and how to behave. I argued in that lecture that these books can be studied not only as religious books of faith, but also as historical documents. That will be the approach we take in this course of lectures, trying to understand the New Testament from a historical point of view, suspending our own beliefs or unbeliefs about what it happens to say. The place to begin a historical study of any document is to set it within its own historical context. If we don't know the context of a work, we'll take it out of context. And if we take it out of context, we'll change its meaning. This is one of the reasons why so many people have so many disputes about the meaning of the New Testament. As you can see, just at any time when you turn on your television to watch a televangelist or to hear somebody on the radio, people from different perspectives have widely different views of the New Testament. It's not simply because of their own perspectives. It's also because most people don't try to understand what the New Testament might have originally meant within its own context. If you change the context of something, you change what it means. This is a point I try to teach my students, and I have to admit it's rather difficult to convince them. But I try to do so by showing several illustrations from their own lives of how things in different contexts mean different things. This is true not only of words, but also of actions. And let me give you two illustrations to make my point before getting on to show what the historical context of the New Testament itself was. Take any group of words, words that would be commonly sensible within a particular context, where if you change the context, you change what they mean. Suppose you heard somebody say, "I love this course." Well, what is the context within which they're saying these words? If you hear somebody saying that while walking out of a classroom on a university campus, I love this course, well, it'd make perfect sense what it means. It would mean that the person has a real affection for the professor or for the syllabus, or they really like this course of study they're engaged in. What if you hear the same words by somebody who's on the back nine of the local golf course who is about to break par? I love this course. Well, same words, but it means something quite different. What if you hear it from a precocious young woman who's sitting at a posh restaurant in the middle of a 5-course meal, and she says, I love this course? Well, you might think that, of course, these things all mean basically the same thing. Somebody loves something that they call a course. What if, though, you're in a boring classroom on where you've got a professor who's droning on, and a student in the back row leans over to somebody else and says snidely, I love this course, and snickers? Same words, but in fact it would mean just the opposite. It would mean, in fact, I hate this course. It depends on the context and how something is said. Words mean what they do depending on their context. So too with gestures, actions, deeds. Everything that we experience means something within its own context. What if you see somebody standing upright with their arm raised up over their head and their index finger pointed up? What does it mean? Well, it depends. Is this a spectator at an air show? Look what's happening. Is it an athlete on the basketball court after they won the national championship? We're number one. Is it a fervent Pentecostal at a revival meeting? There's one way to heaven. Or is it a desperate second grader on the back row who's had too much orange juice for breakfast and needs to do something about it quick? A gesture means what it does depending on its context. So too everything within our experience. Since context determines the meaning of all of our words and our actions, we need to ask what the context of a historical document was if we're going to understand it. And so for this class, what was the context within which Jesus himself lived and the books of the New Testament were written? I won't be able to say a lot about the context of the New Testament in this lecture. That, in fact, would require a course of 24 lectures of its own, simply to begin to cover the waterfront. But I can at least say a few things in this lecture about the religious environment of the Greco-Roman world. In the next lecture, then, I'll talk more specifically about Judaism, the religion that Jesus himself was born into and most of the New Testament authors originally adhered to. Scholars usually refer to the religions of the New Testament world as Greco-Roman cults, commonly called paganism. I want to begin by defining three key terms: the term Greco-Roman world, the term paganism, and the term cult. This first term will take a little bit of time to unpack. The Greco-Roman world. When scholars use the term Greco-Roman world, they're referring to the lands around the Mediterranean from roughly the time of Alexander the Great, who lived around 300 BC, to the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who lived around AD 300. Alexander the Great. Alexander was born in the year 356 BC, the son of Philip of Macedon, who was the ruler of Macedonia. Upon his father's execution, Alexander took over and engaged in a military campaign in which he conquered most of the Mediterranean area, from his native land, Macedonia, down into Greece, and then further east, including Egypt, Palestine, and Persia. Alexander had, as a youth, studied under the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Under Aristotle, he had acquired an appreciation of Greek culture, Greek religion. As he conquered lands around the Mediterranean, Alexander promoted the adoption of Greek culture in these various lands. He built Greek cities according to the Greek model, in which there would be gymnasia and temples and various other Greek institutions. He urged the adoption of Greek language among the elite of these various cities. Generally, he tried to propagate Greek culture, so that he was not only conquering places, he was trying to subdue them culturally so as to unify the areas that he conquered under one common Greek culture. This is significant, of course, for the New Testament. As I've pointed out already, the New Testament itself was written in Greek. Well, why in Greek? Because Palestine and the lands around the Mediterranean, where these various books were written, were already under the influence of Alexander's Greek culture. The Greek word for Greece is Hellas. The Hellenistic world is therefore the world that had adopted Greek culture in the wake of Alexander's conquests. The Romans eventually conquered most of these lands a couple of centuries after Alexander. Originally, Rome had been a kingdom, and it started off as a small village. It was eventually ruled by kings. By the time of the New Testament, it had been a republic for 500 years, meaning it had been ruled by a senate. And just before the New Testament period, it had become an empire, ruled by an emperor, principally, rather than the senate. The first century BC had been a time of significant upheaval within the Roman world. Civil wars, including such things as the assassination of Julius Caesar, whose adopted son, his nephew, named Octavius, some years after Julius's assassination, quelled the civil wars and, as a great general, brought peace and prosperity to the empire. He himself, in fact, was proclaimed then as the first emperor, Octavius, renamed Caesar Augustus. Under Caesar Augustus, there was a time of peace and prosperity within the confines of the Roman world. This was a world that eventually stretched all the way from England in the west to Syria in the east, and stretched from North Africa in the south and Egypt on up into what would be today the central states of Western Europe. The countries throughout the area were brought under Roman rule and were forced to pay tribute to Rome in exchange for services rendered. Roman troops guarded the borders on the frontiers. The Rome economy was agrarian. There wasn't much industry. The way people in Rome maintained their wealth and attained their wealth was through owning land. The empire itself was supported by requiring tribute from its subject states, tribute usually in the form of crops and taxes then that would buy the various things that Rome wanted. Rome itself, of course, the city of Rome, was a magnificent place which had been funded by the provinces who were forced to pay tribute to them. It's a mistake to think that the Romans had their armies throughout the entire empire. They had their armies situated on the frontiers to guard against invasions from other places. This was a time begun by Caesar Augustus of peace within the empire. On the borders of the empire, of course, there continued to be wars. There was a significant war that we're going to talk about later in this course within Palestine itself, in which there was a Jewish uprising against the Romans that led to the destruction of the capital, Jerusalem, and the burning of the temple in Jerusalem. But for most of the empire, for most of the time, there was relative peace. Caesar Augustus inaugurated what people have since called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a 200-year period of peace and prosperity within the empire. Pax Romana. I tell my students, by the way, that if you have a perfectly good English term for a concept that you're much better off using the Latin to show that you've been through university. So we don't call this the Roman peace, we call this the Pax Romana. There were a number of benefits associated with the Pax Romana. Throughout the entire empire, people could speak the same language. Rather than promoting the adoption of Latin, which was Rome's own language, the Romans continued the use of Greek throughout the empire so that people could travel the entire expanse of the empire and make themselves understood by speaking Greek, much as today people can speak English in large stretches of Europe. There was a common coinage throughout the empire so that one didn't have to have a currency exchange whenever one crossed over a boundary. There were roads that the Romans built for their armies that made travel possible. There was relative safety throughout the empire and peace. These were all benefits brought to that part of the world through the Pax Romana. They were benefits that helped eventually Christianity to spread throughout the empire because Christians could take advantage of the situation in order to propagate their faith. If Christianity starts with Jesus and his apostles in the first century, they did not have a huge impact on the Roman world for several centuries, as we'll see in a later lecture. The first emperor to convert to Christianity was the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Prior to that time, virtually everyone in the Roman world, except for the Jews and, of course, the small group of Christians, adhered to local and state religions or cults. These people, the non-Jews and the non-Christians, are often called pagans by modern scholars. I need to be clear in this context that the term pagan, when used by historians, does not have derogatory connotations. It doesn't mean the same thing as I mean when I call my next door neighbor a pagan. A pagan in this context was simply somebody who subscribed to any of the polytheistic religions found throughout the empire. These religions are often called cults, not because they were dangerous and marginalized. The word cult itself is short for the Latin term cultus deorum, Latin for care of the gods, cultus deorum, care of the gods. Just as in English we have the term agriculture, which means care of the fields, you can have cultus deorum, care of the gods. These are cults then because they are concerned with caring for the needs of the gods. How is that done? Principally through sacrifices and prayers. One way to understand the religious cults scattered throughout the Roman Empire is to contrast them with what we might think of as religion today. For most people today, it only makes sense to say that there's one God. If there's any God, there's one God. For most ancient people, that common sense, in fact, was nonsense. Most ancient people couldn't understand at all the idea that there would be only one God. Most people throughout antiquity, in fact, virtually everybody throughout antiquity, except for the Jews and then the Christians, were polytheists, believing in many gods. There were, of course, the great gods, known to us today through ancient mythology. Greek gods like Zeus and Ares and Aphrodite, or their Roman equivalents, Jupiter and Mars and Venus. But there were lots of other gods. Gods who were local deities, who protected and cared for cities or towns and villages. Even less powerful gods who were in charge of even smaller places, gods in charge of a forest or of a river or of a road. Families had their own gods, gods who oversaw every human function and activity, the crops, the cupboard, the hearth, the personal health of a family member, childbirth, gods in charge of virtually every function. These ancient religions then, first of all, differ from ours in that they subscribe to polytheistic views. Second of all, most people today think that only one religion can possibly be true. If one religion is true, then others have to be false. Ancient people simply didn't see it that way. Since there were lots of gods, there was no reason to think that one God was any better than any other god, or that only one God was to be worshipped and praised. They were all gods, and so they all deserved to be worshipped. For this reason, the religions of the Greco-Roman world were far more tolerant of one another than most religions are in our world today. We might think of Roman religion as being intolerant because of what we know happened to the Christians who were persecuted by Romans. I'll say some things about that in a later lecture. By and large, a more striking feature of Roman religion was that it was highly tolerant precisely because it was so widely polytheistic. You could worship any gods you wanted to in any way you wanted to, and nobody else really much cared. Everyone was, of course, expected to worship the state gods. These were the gods that had made the Roman Empire great, and so, of course, they deserved to be worshipped, and if you refused to worship them, then you must have some ulterior motive for refusing. In other words, it was seen to be a political offense not to worship the state gods. These gods were often worshipped at major state festivals, which were looked forward to and enjoyed as a time of vacation from work, and a time with family and friends, a time to feast and to drink. Christians, of course, refused to participate in these state cults because they thought to worship these other gods was to compromise one's commitment to the true God. Most other people, in fact, virtually everybody else, though, didn't see a problem with worshiping the state gods along with their local gods and along with their family gods. So, first point, ancient religions were polytheistic. Second point, they tended not to look upon one religion as true and others as false. Third point, for most people today, religion is a matter of constant devotion to God. For ancient people, on the other hand, religion was a periodic matter. Not a matter of continual devotion, but a matter of periodic attention to the gods. These gods didn't demand constant devotion. They simply demanded sacrifices at set times in the calendar and as the occasion arose. Most gods, in fact, in the ancient world, were completely uninterested in how people lived their daily lives. They were uninterested in how people lived their daily lives. This is not to say that ancient people were unconcerned with matters of ethics. Ancient people were concerned about ethics as much as we are today. But in this ancient world, ethics were a matter of philosophy, not a matter of religion. There were very few ethical activities that were considered to be relevant to religion. Religion, then, was almost exclusively a matter of ritual performances of sacrifice and prayer, not of daily devotion. Fourth, for most people today, it only makes sense to say that religion is a matter of proper belief. What you believe is what matters about religion. Oddly enough, for most ancient people, this wasn't the case at all. Far less important than what you believed about the gods was that you performed the proper cultic acts in their honor. Sacrifices of animals and foodstuffs and prayers performed at home, occasionally at the local temple, and on big occasions at civic festivals. Odd as it might seem to us today, in the ancient world it didn't much matter what you believed about the gods, only how you worshiped them through cultic acts. And so there weren't set doctrines to be believed. There weren't sacred books to study. There weren't creeds to recite. As a result, there was no such thing in these religions as a heretic or a false believer. You either practiced them or you didn't. Fifth, for many people today, the question of religion is a question of securing the afterlife. In other words, for many people, religion today is a matter of acquiring proper fire insurance. Most of my students think that if there's no afterlife, then there's no point in religion. I mean, if you're not going to go to heaven if you're good or go to hell if you're bad, then why not party all the time? Ancient people, interestingly enough, didn't see it this way at all. As it turns out, most people in the ancient world didn't even believe in an afterlife. There is talk about afterlife in some literary texts from the ancient world, but recent studies of inscriptions on tombstones and other material remains demonstrate pretty clearly that most people thought that when you died, that was the end of the story. Why then would you bother to be religious? For most ancient people, religion wasn't a matter of the afterlife. It was a matter of securing the favor of the gods in the here and now. These were people who lived life close to the edge for the most part. In a world when there are no modern methods of irrigation, when there are not massive possibilities of transportation of goods, when there isn't any advanced technology or sophisticated machinery, when there isn't modern medicine, things are very different. This is a world in which getting a tooth abscess will normally kill you. This is a world in which every adult woman of childbearing age has to bear an average of 5 children in order to keep the population constant. This is a different world from ours, in which life is lived on the edge. The worship of the gods is not meant to secure the afterlife, it's to secure the present life. By worshiping the gods, you can convince them to help you win your battles, secure the love of the woman next door, keep healthy, grow your crops. You can sustain life in the present. Sixth, for many people today, God is far beyond us in every imaginable way. God is the creator above all, who has an unbridgeable chasm between where he is and what we are. The ancients didn't quite see it that way. The ancients did, of course, think of the divine realm as something fantastically great, but there was not an unbridgeable chasm between the gods and humans. As I've already indicated, within the polytheistic system, there is a kind of a hierarchy of the gods. We might think of it as a kind of divine pyramid, with the most powerful god or gods at the very top. Some ancient pagans did believe in one ultimate god who was over all. Under this great god, there were the other gods, say the gods of Mount Olympus that we know about from mythology, the state gods, who are far beyond what we can imagine in terms of power and strength. Below these gods, there are various local gods who aren't quite as powerful as the state gods. Below them would be family gods and various smaller local gods. All of these gods, of course, are far beyond human capacity. But near the bottom of this divine pyramid, there's another kind of layer of divine beings that are a lot more like us. In fact, people who might be called divine men. Divine men, human beings who are born to the union of a god and a mortal, who are more powerful than the rest of us, someone like Hercules, or Greek Heracles, or someone who's completely awe-inspiring, like the Roman emperor, or somebody who is supernaturally wise, like Plato. Ancient people believed that there were, in fact, divine humans. I sometimes begin my classes on New Testament at Chapel Hill by talking about an individual we know about from about 2,000 years ago, who is a remarkable person. Even before he was born, his mother had a visitant from heaven telling her that her son wasn't going to be a normal human being, he was going to be the Son of God. His birth was attended by supernatural signs. As a child, he showed himself to be quite a prodigy, impressing the religious leaders of his own day. As an adult, he left home and engaged in an itinerant preaching ministry in which he went from village to town trying to convince people that they could give up on the material things of this world and simply be concerned about the spiritual things of life. He acquired a number of followers who became convinced that he wasn't immortal, that he was divine. And he did miracles to help them believe what they believed about him. He was able to heal the sick and cast out demons and raise the dead. At the end of his life, his enemies decided to bring him up on charges before the Roman authorities, before whom he appeared. But even after he left this world, his followers continued to believe in him. Some claim they saw him alive after he had ascended to heaven, that he appeared to them to convince them that there is a life after this death. Some of them later even wrote books about him. But I doubt if any of you have read the books. In fact, as with my students at Chapel Hill, you probably don't know who I've been talking about. I've been referring to Apollonius of Tyana, a pagan philosopher, a worshiper of the Greek gods. Apollonius of Tyana lived at about the same time as Jesus, 1st century of the Common Era. His followers believed that he was the Son of God. They knew about Jesus. They thought that Jesus was a magician and that he practiced magic and that he was a hoax. Well, the followers of Jesus thought this about Apollonius of Tyana. We have stories like those of Apollonius and like those of Jesus, of people who were born supernaturally, who could do miracles, deliver supernatural teachings, who then ascended into heaven. Why? Because these people thought that there wasn't an unbridgeable chasm between the gods and humans, that in fact there was some commerce between the divine realm and the human realm. These stories about divine men, like Apollonius of Tyana and others, may sound unusual to us. We know only stories about Jesus that sound like this, but in the ancient world there were lots of people who had stories told about them of this sort. People in the ancient world would make perfect sense about the stories of Jesus because in fact they knew of other divine men who were widely recognized as having commerce with the divine realm. And so, let me just wrap this up. In this lecture, we've seen the importance of establishing the historical context for Jesus and his followers, including those among his followers who eventually wrote the books of the New Testament. It's important to understand the emergence of the Christian religion within this context of other religions of the Greco-Roman world. Religions that were thoroughly polytheistic, and by and large that were widely tolerant of one another. These other religions focused on cultic acts of sacrifice in the temples to the gods, and on prayers rather than on doctrines. They were religions that focused on the activities of the gods in the present, in the here and now, rather than in the afterlife. And they thought that there were divine humans who were manifest among us. Far and away, though, the most important religion for understanding the context of Jesus and early Christianity is Judaism, a religion that stood apart from the pagan religions of its environment. In the next lecture, we'll explore some of the important features of this ancient Jewish religion. In the last lecture, we saw that in order to understand the New Testament, we need to place it within its own historical context. And so we considered the pagan religions of the Greco-Roman world. And we saw how they differed from modern religion in their emphasis on polytheism, their stress on diversity, tolerance, cultic acts, and life in the present. We now can move to the religion of particular importance for the understanding of Jesus and the New Testament, the religion of ancient Judaism. Even though Judaism is often portrayed, even by modern scholars, as being completely unlike any other religion in its ancient environment, a moment's thought shows that this could not have been the case. If Judaism were completely unlike every other religion, it wouldn't have been recognized as a religion at all. We can only recognize something in relationship to other things that are within our own experience. Let me illustrate this point. Sometimes in order to impress my students, I tell them that when I was in college, I drove an Austin Healey Sprite. Unfortunately, this doesn't impress anyone because my students don't know what an Austin Healey Sprite was. And so I have to explain it to them, but I explain it in terms that they can understand. So sometimes I'll tell them, well, an Austin Healey Sprite was kind of like an MG. In fact, it was the same car as the MG Midget. Well, what if they don't know what an MG Midget was? Then I say, an MG Midget was like a Mazda Miata. Now, most of my students know what a Mazda Miata is, but if they don't, I have to explain. Mazda Miata is a sports car. Well, what if they don't know what a sports car is? A sports car is a small car, a two-seater that usually sits low to the ground and is considered sporty. What if they don't know what a car is? Well, they do. But what if they didn't? Well, a car is like a horseless carriage. What if they don't know what horses are or carriages are? The way you explain something is by explaining it in terms that somebody already understands. Imagine how you yourself might try to explain what an aardvark is to somebody, or what a kumquat is. You have to explain things in terms that people already understand, because the only way we understand anything is in its relationship to other things that are like it. Judaism was like other religions of the ancient world in many respects. To be sure, it was also different, but it had some similarities. Like pagans, ancient Jews believed in a divine realm that was inhabited by one supreme God, but they also believed that there were other divine beings of lesser power, beings like angels and archangels and demons, seraphim and cherubim. In other words, they also had a divine realm that could be structured as a kind of a pyramid, with, of course, the one true God at the top. Like pagans, Jews had sacred places that were especially devoted to their worship of this God, where sacrifices could be made and prayers could be recited. Like pagans, Jews saw worship as principally involving cultic acts, animal sacrifices, and prayers in accordance with their ancient tradition. Sacrifices and prayers that were meant to propitiate God and to demonstrate their devotion to Him. Like pagans, most Jews were far more concerned with life in the present rather than life after death. God was the God of this world, and He was particularly concerned about how people lived within it. And so there are a number of very basic similarities between Jews and pagans in the ancient world. At the same time, there were significant differences between Jews and everyone else. And so, to understand Judaism more fully, we should talk about areas of distinctiveness, areas of Judaism that made it unlike other ancient religions, realizing, of course, at the same time that there was a good deal of diversity among all the pagans and also within Judaism. And so what are the distinctive features of Judaism? First, possibly the most distinctive feature of ancient Judaism in opposition to various forms of paganism is that Judaism was monotheistic. Some pagans, as we've seen, thought that there was one God who was above all others, but Jews took this even further. There was only one God who was to be worshipped and served. This was the God who had created the universe. This God was more powerful than all the other gods. Most Jews at a very early period did believe that there were other gods. Evidence for this is found in the Bible itself. In the Hebrew Bible, the Ten Commandments, the first of the Ten Commandments says, "You shall have no other gods before me," which presupposes that the other gods existed. They simply weren't to be worshipped ahead of the God of Israel. At an earlier time, most Jews did believe that there were other gods, but that only one God was to be worshipped. By the time of the first century, the time of the New Testament, though, many Jews had come to believe that there was really only one ultimate God. This God was not the God of a particular locality as many pagan deities were. Originally, the Jewish God may have been a local deity, namely the deity of the land of Judah. The name Jew, by the way, comes from the fact that originally Jews came from Judah. Eventually, when Jews were dispersed outside of their homeland, Judah, they continued to worship the God of Judah, and so were known by other people as Jews, people who worship the God of Judah. This God, by the first century, was not thought to be a local God, but a universal God who had created the world. This God was far beyond anything people could think or imagine. He was so holy, so distinct from everything else, that not even his name could be pronounced. Jews, therefore, spelled God's name in a way that couldn't be pronounced. This is the famous Tetragrammaton, the 4 letters which consist of God's name. The 4 letters which represented God's personal name that was never to be pronounced. This one God, who was so holy and so far removed from us, who had created the world, was the only one who was to be worshipped. And so the first distinctive aspect of Judaism, they were monotheists. Second of all, Jews believed that this one God, the creator of all, had made a covenant with his people. The term covenant means a treaty or a pact. Jews believed that God had made a covenant, a treaty or a pact, with the ancestors of the Jewish people. He had agreed to protect and honor them so long as they agreed to worship him and to behave in the ways that he instructed them. This covenant, as recorded in the Hebrew Bible, was made with the father of the Jews, Abraham. It was confirmed, though, under Moses, the great Savior of Israel, whom God had raised up to deliver his people out of their slavery in Egypt. After Moses led the Exodus out of Egypt, God gave him his law on Mount Sinai. This was the law that was to direct the worship and communal life of God's people, Israel. And in fact, this law comprises the third major distinctive aspect of Judaism. The law of Moses represented the covenantal obligation of the Jews to God. This law came to be embedded in writings, particularly the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which are sometimes simply called the Torah. The word Torah is a Hebrew word which means literally guidance or direction, or somewhat more woodenly, it means law. And so the Torah is often used simply as a designation of the law of Moses, the Torah. The word is sometimes also used to refer to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible in which this law can be found: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 books as a group, sometimes called the law, sometimes they're known under the Greek name Pentateuch. Pentateuch, Greek for the 5 scrolls. I want to take a brief excursus to explain that many Christians in the modern world haven't understood the importance of the law within Judaism. Many Christians have been raised to think that the law was some kind of undoable list of do's and don'ts, which had to be followed in order to attain salvation, but since it was undoable, couldn't be followed for salvation, so that Jews were stuck with a law they couldn't keep, which therefore ended up leading them into damnation. In fact, Jews never saw the law as an undoable list of do's and don'ts. Instead, the law was seen by most Jews as the greatest gift God had ever given to humans. This was God's direction on how to worship him and on how Jews could live together in their communities. Jews saw the law as the greatest joy because following the law meant yielding oneself to the all-powerful and loving God who ruled the universe and had called his people out of their slavery. Following the law was not a requirement for salvation for ancient Jews. Following the law was a response to the salvation that God had already given his people. Included in the law, of course, were not just the 10 Commandments, but also laws that were designed to make the Jews distinct from other peoples. Jews, for example, were to circumcise their baby boys. They were not to work 1 day out of 7 on the Sabbath. They were to observe special food laws, keeping kosher, not eating, for example, pork or shrimp. These were laws that were designed to keep Jews distinct from other peoples. And so, distinctive aspects of Judaism: monotheism, the covenant, the law. Fourth, Jews had distinctive places of worship. Especially, Jews in the first century worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem. Pagan religions had temples where sacrifices were performed and prayers could be said to the gods. Jews, unlike other peoples, had only one temple where sacrifices could be performed. It was a temple that was located in accordance with the law itself, the Torah itself, in the city of Jerusalem. This was a fabulously large and glorious place in the days of Jesus. It was large. If you've visited the temple remains in Jerusalem today, you'll know how large it was. The walls surrounding the temple encompassed an area that was large enough to place 25 American football fields in. These were big walls, 10 stories high. The inner parts of the temple were magnificently done. In the days of Jesus, parts of it were overlaid with gold. It was an extremely expensive and glorious sight that Jews would come from all over the world to visit and to worship in. This was the only place in Judaism where animal sacrifices could be offered to God. Moreover, since animal sacrifices were so much a part of the religion, according to the law, people were to sacrifice animals, the temple then was the central place for all Jewish worship. As I've indicated, it was located in the capital city of Judea, Jerusalem. Jews would come to Jerusalem to worship in the temple from all over the world, especially during annual festivals like the Passover feast, which commemorated the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt under Moses. Most Jews in the first century, of course, didn't live anywhere near Jerusalem, but they had scattered throughout the Mediterranean at different periods of foreign conquest. Since the temple was so remote for most Jews, since most Jews couldn't ever go there, if they could go there, maybe they could go once during their lifetime, since it was so remote for most Jews, there developed by the time of the New Testament a practice of having local places of worship called synagogues. The word synagogue is a Greek term again, which simply means a gathering together. A synagogue was a place where Jews could gather together for prayer and the study of Torah. A synagogue at this time could be formed wherever there was a quorum of 10 adult men. There were no sacrifices performed in the synagogue. Instead, the synagogue was a place of prayer and the reading and interpretation of Torah, undertaken on the Jewish day of rest, the Sabbath. And so the fourth distinctive characteristic of Jews, their distinctive places of worship. To this point, I've described some of the basic features of Judaism, both how it's similar to and how it's different from pagan religions of the ancient world. Many people make the mistake of thinking that Judaism in this ancient world was some kind of monolith, that there was one thing called Judaism. In fact, Judaism in the first century was no more monolithic than modern Christianity is today. People are more widely aware in our context of the diversity of modern Christianity. There are similarities between Greek Orthodox priests and Appalachian snake handlers, but in fact there are a lot of differences too that are often more striking. Ancient Judaism in many ways was even more diverse than modern Christianity. I won't be able to explain all the diversity of early Judaism now. I do want to illustrate it, though, by talking about some of the major aspects of Judaism that we know about that represent its diversity. One way to illustrate its diversity is to talk about the four major groups that we know about from the time of Jesus. I should emphasize that it's not the case that every Jew belonged to one of these four groups. There were Jews who believed all sorts of strange things that don't sound much like what we think of as Judaism that didn't belong to these four groups. These four groups all agreed on the basic tenets of Judaism that I've laid out, but there were striking differences among them. The four groups that I'll be talking about are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and what's called the fourth philosophy. The best known group were the Pharisees. The word Pharisee probably comes from an ancient Persian word which means separated ones. This group was called Pharisees because they were separated off from other people because of their eminent holiness. Pharisees have been widely misunderstood, again, in modern Christian circles. Many people associate the term Pharisee with hypocrite. In fact, in some modern dictionaries, one of the tertiary definitions of Pharisees is hypocrite, which is an interesting designation when you think about it. It'd be comparable to having a dictionary in 2,000 years defining Episcopalians as drunkards or Baptists as adulterers. Of course, there are probably drunkards among Episcopalians and adulterers among Baptists, but defining them in those terms is a little bit odd. Same thing with Pharisees. Pharisees were not professional hypocrites, or as I tell my students, they didn't have to take a Hippocratic oath to be a Pharisee. The Pharisees were, in fact, a highly committed group of Jews who believed in following the Torah, God's law, absolutely as far as possible. They believed that the law had been given by God to direct the people of Israel. Therefore, this law had to be followed. It was a blueprint, in a sense, for the lives of how people ought to live their lives. The problem with the law of Moses for many Jews in the first century was that this law is not explicit in how it ought to be followed, and in many places is completely ambiguous. For example, the law says that a person is to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, what does that mean and how does one do it? Most Jews thought that this meant you shouldn't work on the Sabbath. Fine, but what does it mean to work? Well, if you're a farmer, probably working would involve harvesting your crops. Well, you shouldn't harvest crops on the Sabbath then. What if you aren't really harvesting your crops, but you just want something to eat, and you go into your fields and pick some grain to eat it? Is that work or not? Well, some people would consider that to be comparable to harvesting, and some wouldn't. Well, a decision has to be made. If you're to keep the Sabbath day holy, are you allowed to go into your field on the Sabbath and eat grain? Some people said yes, some said no. What if you go through the field on the Sabbath and you don't actually eat the grain, but you walk through and you knock some of the grain off? Is that permitted? Well, on one hand, that's kind of like harvesting, because you're taking the grain from the stalk. But on the other hand, it's obviously not work, so is it permitted or not? A decision has to be made. Pharisees were concerned to make the right decisions, and so they developed a set of laws that are sometimes called the oral laws that would help them interpret the written law of Moses. These oral laws and the debates about these laws were eventually written down nearly 200 years after Jesus in a book that is now called the Mishnah, which is the heart of the large collection of Jewish lore and learning called the Talmud. Pharisees were behind the collection of these oral laws that were intended to help Jews follow the written law of Moses. Nothing necessarily hypocritic about this particular activity. They simply wanted to do what God had told them to do. In short, in their religious outlook, Pharisees stressed the law. The Pharisees were sometimes opposed by the second group, known as the Sadducees, who did not subscribe to the oral law. We are not well informed about the Sadducees because none of them left us any writings. It does appear, though, that Sadducees were made up of the upper-class aristocracy of the Jews. Many of them appear to have been priests in the Jewish temple. And since they comprised the aristocracy, many of them served as a kind of liaison with the ruling power, the Romans. In their religious outlook, since the Sadducees were connected with the temple, Sadducees appear to have stressed temple sacrifice and the need to perform sacrifices as God had prescribed within the law. So, you have Pharisees stressing the oral laws, Sadducees who don't accept the Pharisees' oral laws but instead stress sacrifice in the temple. The third group is called the Essenes. Ironically, the Essenes are the one group of the four that are not mentioned in the New Testament, but that are the group that we are best informed about because of recent archaeological discoveries. The Essenes were a group of highly religious Jews who believed that the rest of the people of Israel had fallen away from God and become impure. Essenes worked to preserve their own purity apart from the impurity of those around them. Occasionally, they founded their own monastic communities where they could live together and worship God. Their stress is on ritual purity in the face of impurity around them. One such monastic community that the Essenes founded was located at a place called Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a library of an Essene community located to the northwest of the Dead Sea. This library has been significant for a number of reasons. For one thing, it included some very ancient texts of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the texts of the Hebrew Bible, the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, are 1,000 years earlier than other surviving manuscripts that we had for the Hebrew Bible. So they've been extremely important to reconstruct what the original Hebrew Bible might have said. Even more importantly for our context, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain documents produced for and by this Essene community itself, so that by reading these documents, we can discover what rules this community followed in its communal life together. The books also contain hymnals, books of psalms, commentaries on Scripture, and interestingly, prophetic descriptions of future events. In their religious outlook, the Essenes stressed the need to maintain their own purity in view of the fact that the world as we know it, or at least as they knew it, was soon going to come to a crashing halt. They believed that God was going to intervene in history, overthrow the forces of evil, including the forces that had inspired many Jews, the Jewish leaders, especially their enemies, the Sadducees. Fourth group of Jews is sometimes simply called the fourth philosophy. This fourth philosophy comprised a number of groups of Jews who believed that God had given them the land of Israel, who also believed that since a foreign power dominated the land, that God had given them the authorization and the power to overthrow the domineering force. In other words, the fourth philosophy proposed to engage in violent resistance to the foreign powers dominating the land. Eventually, the fourth philosophy had its way. In the year 66 AD, just a generation after Jesus' death, there was a revolt against the Romans that broke out, leading to a 3.5-year war that ended in the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. The religious outlook of the fourth philosophy then centered on the Jewish homeland as given to the Jewish people that should not be ruled by any foreign power. To this point, I've talked about some of the major aspects of Judaism and some of the diversity. I want to end this lecture by talking about one particular kind of Jewish perspective that has proved particularly important for understanding the historical Jesus and the New Testament. This is a perspective that modern scholars have called ancient Jewish apocalypticism. We know about Jewish apocalypticism from a number of ancient sources, including some books of the Hebrew Bible, like the book of Daniel, and some non-biblical books, including those of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This appears to have been a widespread form of belief among many ancient Jews, held by some Pharisees, maybe a lot of Pharisees, held by Essenes and by others. The major tenets of this form of Judaism are as follows. First, apocalypticists held to a dualistic view of the world. They believed that there were two fundamental components of reality, the forces of good and the forces of evil, and everything and everybody aligns themselves with one or the other of these forces. Moreover, history itself was seen dualistically. We are now living in an evil age, ruled by the forces of evil, including the devil and demons and sin and disease and death. These are all powers opposed to us that are ruling this world. But there's an age that's coming that will be good, an age in which God will overthrow the forces of evil and establish his good kingdom here on earth. And so the first point, apocalypticists were dualists, believing in two cosmic forces, good and evil, and in two ages, this evil age and the age to come. Apocalypticists were pessimists. They didn't believe that there was much possibility of improving life in this world through human effort. The forces of evil were in control of this age, and they were going to make life worse and worse. But third, God was going to vindicate his name at the end of this age. There is a day of judgment coming in which God would judge this world and overthrow the forces of evil. All people would be judged, not just those who are alive, but also those who had died. People shouldn't think that they can side with the forces of evil and prosper, rise to the top of the heap, and then die and get away with it. God isn't going to allow anybody to side with evil and get away with it. At the end of this age, there would be a resurrection of the dead, when God would force all people to face judgment, either for reward or punishment. He would then bring in his good kingdom. When would this happen? Fourth point, this coming judgment of God was imminent. It would happen very soon. In fact, it was right around the corner. In the words of one famous Jewish apocalypticist of the first century, "Truly I tell you, some of you standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power." These, in fact, are the words of Jesus, one of the best-known Jewish apocalypticists from the first century. "Truly I tell you," says Jesus, "this generation will not pass away before all these things take place." Apocalypticism is going to be a very important aspect of Judaism for us to consider in the context of the New Testament. Quickly, in conclusion, if we're to understand Jesus and the New Testament, we have to situate it within its own historical context of first century Judaism. Jews were like pagans in many respects, but they were also distinct, especially in their emphasis on monotheism, the one God, the law that he gave, the covenant that he gave. In addition, they had distinctive places of worship. We've seen the diversity of Judaism in the four major parties, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and fourth philosophy, but especially we've seen one of the distinctive emphases of Judaism, that of Jewish apocalypticism, a view that dominated the teaching not only of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other works of the time, but as we'll see, the teachings of Jesus and his followers. To this point in the course, we've examined the background of Jesus and the New Testament, focusing on the religions of the Greco-Roman world, and in particular early Judaism. With this lecture, we'll begin to move on to the New Testament itself, beginning with the first four books of the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Before plunging into these texts, we should make some initial inquiries into what kind of books these are. Are they historically accurate biographies of Jesus, written by people who saw him do the things that he did? Or are they filled with legends and myths? Are they well-intentioned fictions created by his well-intentioned followers? Are they fact, fiction, or a combination of both? One way to begin is by discussing some significant historical data, the dates of the Gospels in relationship to the events that they narrate. Virtually everyone agrees that Jesus died sometime around the year 30 A.D. Some people think he might have died in the year 29, some 32, some 33, but pretty much everybody agrees it was sometime around the year 30. The Gospels were written probably 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death. Scholars debate the dates of the Gospels, but most scholars are reasonably sure that Mark was the first to have been written, probably around the year 65 to 70 A.D. Matthew and Luke were probably next, written possibly 80 or 85 A.D. The Gospel of John was probably the last Gospel to be written, sometime around 90 or 95 A.D. On these dates, pretty much all scholars agree. What scholars don't agree on is the significance of these dates. For our purposes here, I want to think about the time gap between the death of Jesus and the first accounts of his life. As I've pointed out, it's a time gap of between 35 and 65 years. This gap is significant for our understanding of the character of these our earliest accounts. To put the time gap in modern terms, if the earliest gospel about Jesus was written 35 years after his death, that would be comparable to having the first account of the presidency, the early years of the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, being written this year. Now you think, well, that wouldn't be such a big time gap because I remember quite well Lyndon Johnson's presidency. But imagine somebody writing about the presidency of Lyndon Johnson with no earlier written sources. Somebody today recording what Lyndon Johnson did 35 years ago. That's the shortest time gap between Jesus and the Gospel of Mark. What about the longest gap between Jesus and the Gospel of John? 65 years. That would be like somebody today writing for the first time an account of somebody who was, say, a preacher who was at the height of his career during the Great Depression for the first time. 35 to 65 years separate the life of Jesus from the earliest accounts we have of him. It seems to me that this time gap is significant, and I want to explain why. The explanation has to do with what was happening during all these years, between the year 30 and the year 65 to 95. Of course, there are a lot of things happening in the Roman Empire during those decades. For our purposes, the most important thing that was happening is that Christianity was spreading throughout the empire. According to our surviving sources, Christianity started immediately after Jesus' death with a handful of his followers. According to the book of Acts, our earliest account, Jesus had 11 remaining followers among his disciples after his death because Judas had killed himself, and a handful of women, so say 20 followers. These followers were located in Jerusalem. They had been people who had accompanied Jesus on his ministry throughout his life. Between that point of time and the end of the first century, Christianity had spread to the major urban areas of the Mediterranean as Christians propagated their belief in Jesus as the Son of God who had died for the sins of the world. Within 40 or 50 years, this tiny band of, say, 20, possibly a few more, possibly a few less, disciples had multiplied themselves many times over, having spread the new religion based on Jesus throughout the cities of the Mediterranean. In this age, before the possibilities and problems posed for us by mass media, Christians necessarily propagated their religion by word of mouth. That is, by telling stories about Jesus from one person to the next. Stories about who Jesus was, what he taught, what he did, how he died. People were trying to convert others to Christianity, and the only way to do it effectively was to tell somebody the stories. We don't have evidence of people doing massive revivals or tent meetings. We don't have evidence of people having big campaign rallies in the Colosseum trying to convert people to Christianity. It appears to have been a one-to-one sort of propagation of the faith. People then are telling stories about Jesus in order to convert others, and then when people are converted, they form church communities, and stories continue to be told within the churches. This is happening not just in Jerusalem. It's happening throughout the cities and villages of Judea, up in Samaria, up in Asia Minor, over in Macedonia and Achaia, which is modern-day Greece, over in Italy, possibly in North Africa, certainly in Egypt. Throughout the Mediterranean, people are converting to Christianity and telling the stories about Jesus. Who is telling the stories? That's a key question for our discussion of the Gospels, which are written 35 to 65 years after the death of Jesus. Given the fact that the stories are being told throughout this entire region, they're obviously being told in different languages, in different areas. I think we're probably safe to say that the people who are telling the stories about Jesus, by and large, were not Jesus' own followers. They must have been people, by and large, who had been converted to believe in Jesus after the fact. Let me illustrate how the process worked by simply coming up with a hypothetical example. Imagine for a second that you are a businessman who lives in the city of Ephesus in Asia Minor. Someone has come through town on business or for some other reason and has met you and told you stories about the Son of God in Judea who did miracles and delivered great teachings, but then was crucified by the Roman governor of Judea. You hear more stories, and the more you hear, you decide that you're interested in believing in this person, and you convert yourself to become a Christian. You go home and tell your family some of the stories you've heard. Say your wife converts, or your husband. Your spouse goes next door and tells the neighbors some of the stories. They become convinced. They convert. One of the neighbors is a businessman who goes off to Smyrna and tells some of the stories there, and people in Smyrna convert, and then they convert their family members. These final family members, from whom did they hear the stories? Well, they heard it from the businessman who came to town, came from Ephesus to Smyrna. Well, where did he hear the stories? Well, he heard it from your spouse. Where did your spouse hear the story? Well, she heard it from you. Where do you hear the stories? You heard it from somebody who came into Ephesus. Where did he hear the stories? Well, you see, as it goes on, as people propagate the faith, necessarily the people telling the stories are the people who had converted on the basis of the stories they heard. But these stories cannot have been told by the eyewitnesses themselves because the religion is propagating too quickly for it to be based simply on eyewitness testimony. Since it's increasing geometrically, the people telling the stories are people who were not there to see these things happen and didn't know anybody who had been there to see these things happen. I don't mean to say that Christianity immediately overtook the world and half of the empire converted within 40 or 50 years. It simply didn't happen that way. As we'll see later in the course, the empire itself didn't convert until much, much later. But there were pockets of Christians who started emerging during these years in different locales throughout the Mediterranean. Now, for what we want to talk about in this lecture, the key question is, what happened to the stories as they were being narrated by these people at this time throughout the Mediterranean? My contention is that, in fact, the stories got changed as they were told time and time again. The stories about Jesus were modified as people recounted these stories year after year after year. Sometimes, of course, the changes of stories would have been purely accidental. just as every story gets changed when it's told by word of mouth from one person to another. Possibly you've had children who on a birthday played the game telephone. You have a group of kids who sit in a circle, and one child tells the next child a story, who tells it to the next child, tells it to the next child. It goes around the circle, and by the time it comes back to the person who originally told the story, it's a different story. If it didn't work like that, it'd be a rather silly birthday game to play. Yes, you hear the same story you just told, there wouldn't be much excitement in that. Stories get changed when they're told by word of mouth. Imagine playing the game telephone, not in some living room in some summer day among people of the same socioeconomic class, just 12 kids sitting in your room. Suppose, in fact, the game telephone is played for 50 years, where people tell the stories one person to the next in different countries, using different languages, where you have thousands of players. What happens to the stories? My assumption is that the stories get changed. In addition, I would assume that sometimes people change the stories because they wanted to change the stories. After all, people are telling stories about Jesus in order to convert others to believe. And once they believe, they're trying to convince them of certain things to believe and certain ways to act. The stories are told in order to promote faith in Jesus and to promote the right kind of faith in Jesus. Is it possible that sometimes the stories were changed precisely in order to make Jesus look even better than he did before? Or to stress a particular theological point about Jesus' importance? As we're going to see in a moment, there is in fact historical evidence that stories were changed in these ways. There are some standard objections to the idea that the stories about Jesus came to be changed as they circulated by word of mouth throughout the empire. Let me give you a couple of the standard objections. First, many people, somewhat unreflectively I think, assume that stories couldn't have been changed in such a relatively short amount of time, especially when there are eyewitnesses around to verify the accounts. The logic of this is that if there were eyewitnesses someplace, that if stories were told, the eyewitnesses would have checked to make sure that the stories were kept in line with the way things really happened. I said I think this is a bit unreflective, precisely because I don't think it takes very much time to change a story, and because the presence of eyewitnesses usually has nothing to do with the accuracy of an account. Stories can change overnight. Anybody in the news knows this. I occasionally get in the news in a newspaper article or on the radio or something, and invariably what is reported is simply wrong. I have colleagues, in fact, who refuse to do any interviews with newspapers or on radio precisely because they can't expect to be quoted correctly, or some of their views will be misrepresented. It happens overnight, even today in the age of mass media. Moreover, the presence of eyewitnesses simply cannot guarantee accuracy of accounts, especially in a world before email, the internet, the telephone, or even the Pony Express. There's no way to make sure that eyewitnesses are always around to guarantee the accuracy of reports. The second objection that people commonly raise to the idea that the stories of Jesus got changed is that in ancient society, which were oral cultures, people had better memories than those of us do today who are based in written cultures. People living in oral cultures, according to this theory, had an ability to tell stories accurately time after time. They were trained to do this. They had better memories, and therefore when people told stories, they automatically did so with fair accuracy. Unfortunately for this view, anthropological studies done in the past 20 years have shown convincingly that this is not the case at all. That in fact, the very concern for verbal accuracy that lies behind this theory is a concern that's found exclusively in written cultures. The logic is that only in written cultures can one check to determine the accuracy of something that's said. Since you can check in written cultures, there arises a sense that things ought to be accurate. But in oral societies, as it turns out, there is no natural assumption that stories should remain unchanged. These anthropological studies have shown convincingly that, in fact, in oral cultures, the assumption is that stories should be changed depending on the audience to which a story is told. And so, stories appear to have been changed as they're told word of mouth from one person to another in this kind of oral culture. But why would the fact that stories got changed over time, normally, have any effect on the Gospels? After all, the Gospels weren't written by hypothetical businessmen living in Ephesus, but by the disciples of Jesus and their close followers. That is, by eyewitnesses and those who knew eyewitnesses. Were they not? In fact, as scholars have long known, the question of the authorship of the Gospels is not that simple. All four of our Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written anonymously. As I indicated in the first lecture, these books later came to be ascribed to people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In other words, to two of Jesus' disciples, Matthew, the tax collector, John, the beloved disciple, and to two friends of the apostles, Mark, who was thought to be a secretary for the apostle Peter, and Luke, who was thought to be a traveling companion of the apostle Paul. Later, they're attributed to two disciples and two friends of the apostles. These attributions, though, are not original to the Gospels themselves, and they did not arise until the 2nd century, some decades after the Gospels themselves were written. In fact, there are good reasons for doubting that these traditional ascriptions are accurate. Even though Jesus and his followers originally spoke Aramaic, a language that's closely related to Hebrew, the Gospels, as I've pointed out, were written in Greek, not the language of Jesus' own followers. Moreover, Jesus' own disciples, at least according to the New Testament accounts, were by and large lower-class, uneducated peasants. According to the book of Acts, chapter 4, both Peter and John, two of Jesus' principal disciples, were known to be illiterate, the literal meaning of the word used in Acts 4:13. Peter and John were illiterate. The gospel writers, on the other hand, are highly educated and literate. In addition, all of these gospels are written in the third person. Never in these books does an author say, then Jesus and I went up to Jerusalem, and then we did this, that, or the other thing. The books are never described in the first person, always the third person. These books, then, do not appear to have been written by Jesus' own disciples. They were later ascribed to apostles by later Christians, Christians who were interested in securing their authority as canonical scripture. These traditional ascriptions, though, are late and questionable. Who then were the authors of these books? Well, we can't really say. All that we know is that these books were written by relatively highly educated and literate Greek-speaking Christians living several decades after Jesus, who had heard numerous reports about his life as these reports had been passed down year after year among his followers. They then wrote some of these reports down. If this is so, then it seems likely that the gospel accounts preserve traditions that had been changed over time. Is there, though, any evidence for this view, or is it pure conjecture by modern biblical scholars who have too much time on their hands? In fact, there is evidence that the Gospels contain stories that have been changed over time. We're going to look at some evidence here in the remaining part of this lecture. I'm going to try and illustrate the kind of evidence that's available, more widely available to scholars. I'm going to illustrate it by looking just at two brief accounts. The first account I want to look at has to do with what might seem like a relatively simple and minor question, but it's a pointed question. When did Jesus die? When did Jesus die? Now, before going into this example, I need to stress the point that historians sometimes have to look at what seems to be minutia in order to make a big point. I liken it with my students sometimes to a detective who's investigating a murder case. There may be a highly significant murder case, but the inspector comes into the room with a body on the floor, and instead of being aghast at the immensity of the crime, starts looking for fingerprints or for strands of hair. Something seemingly small and insignificant in comparison with the crime that's been committed. Historians are like that. They have to look for little things, fingerprints, strands of hair, in order to explain something big that's happened. And so this might seem like a little issue, but it has big implications. When did Jesus die? Well, each of the Gospels, of course, narrates the event. Two of them, our earliest Gospel, Mark, and our latest Gospel, John, provide a precise dating for it. All four Gospels indicate that Jesus died sometime during the feast of the Passover, the annual festival that was celebrated in Jerusalem by Jews to commemorate the events of the Exodus from Egypt. The festival had as its background the stories of God's deliverance of his people Israel from their slavery in Egypt under Moses, as recorded in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Exodus. In the first century, Jews would come from all over the world to celebrate this feast. When they came to Jerusalem, they would purchase a lamb that would be eaten at the celebration in the evening. The lambs were sacrificed in the temple on the afternoon before the Passover was actually eaten. The day when the lambs are sacrificed is therefore called the day of preparation for the Passover. Now, it's important for what I want to say to recall that in Jewish reckoning, a new day begins not at midnight, as it does for us, but whenever it gets dark. That's why Jewish Sabbath begins even now on Friday evening at dark, and then continues through Saturday until it gets dark on Saturday. The lambs during the Passover feast then were sacrificed on the day of preparation for the Passover. They were taken home, they were cooked for the evening meal, and when it got dark then, it was the next day, and they would eat then the Passover meal on the day of Passover. Return now to the Gospel accounts. In the earliest account of Jesus' last days, the account found in Mark, the sequence of events leading up to Jesus' death are clearly laid out. The day before Jesus is arrested, Jesus' disciples ask him where he wants them to prepare to eat the Passover meal. Mark chapter 14, verse 12. Where would you have us prepare the Passover? He gives them their instructions. That night, in other words, on the day of the Passover, that night they have the meal in which Jesus takes the symbolic foods of the Passover feast and instills new significance in them. He takes the unleavened bread and he says, "This is my body, which is given for you." He takes the cup of wine and he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Afterwards, Jesus goes out to pray. He's betrayed by Judas Iscariot, handed over to the Jewish authorities for trial. He spends the night in jail. The next morning, that is, the morning after the Passover lambs had been eaten, Jesus appears before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who finds him guilty of criminal charges and orders him executed. Jesus is immediately taken off and crucified, and we're told when this was. 9 o'clock in the morning, according to Mark chapter 15, verse 25. This is a very clear dating of when Jesus died. Our last gospel, the Gospel of John, also provides a precise dating for the events. The sequence of events in John is in many ways similar to that found in the Gospel of Mark, but there are striking differences as well. Here too in John, Jesus also has a last meal with his disciples, but there's no word of it being a Passover meal. The disciples in this gospel never ask where they are to prepare the Passover, and Jesus doesn't speak about the symbolic foods giving them new significance. After the supper in John, Jesus again goes out to pray. He's betrayed by Judas. He's arrested. He spends the night in jail. The next day, he appears before Pontius Pilate and is ordered to be executed. And we're told precisely when it happened. John chapter 19, verse 14, this was on the day of preparation for the Passover at 12 o'clock noon. The day of preparation for the Passover? How could it be the day of preparation for the Passover? According to Mark's gospel, Jesus lived through that day. He had the Passover meal with his disciples that night and was put on the cross the next morning on the day of Passover itself. In John's gospel, though, Jesus was executed before the meal even began. How does one reconcile this discrepancy? Well, it probably can't be reconciled literally, although people try all the time. It is worth noting, though, that the Gospel of John, which has Jesus die on the afternoon before the Passover, has him die precisely when the lambs of God were being slaughtered, the Passover lambs being slaughtered in the temple. Moreover, this gospel is the only gospel that refers to Jesus himself as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. John chapter 1, verse 29, and again 6 verses later, John chapter 1, verse 36. In other words, in John's gospel, Jesus is identified as the Lamb of God, and in John's gospel, Jesus dies precisely on the day and at the time that the lambs were being killed in the temple. Is it possible that John has changed a historical datum in order to make a theological point? That he's changed the day and hour of Jesus' death precisely to show that Jesus really was the Passover lamb. In fact, that appears highly probable. This shows that in John's gospel, at least, we have accounts that have been changed in order to make theological points. We could show example after example of similar things happening throughout the Gospels, where it appears when you have two stories told in two different accounts that there are differences between them, and these differences make sense in light of the theological views of the authors. A natural assumption is that this kind of changing of the accounts, which you can show beyond much doubt within the written texts, was also going on at the oral stages, as people were telling stories about Jesus and modifying them in order to make their points. Sometimes the Gospels record different accounts precisely because they've inherited different oral versions of the same story. You can see this for yourself simply by comparing almost any two accounts in the Gospels. I sometimes ask my students, for example, to read the birth stories of Jesus in Matthew and in Luke, and to make a list of everything that is said to have happened to Jesus at his birth in Matthew and Luke, and then to compare the two lists. What's really striking is that the Christmas story we tell every year around December 25 is a conflation of these two accounts. But look at the accounts carefully sometime on your own. Compare them with one another and see not only how they're different, but whether there are any discrepancies between them. One way to get at it is to ask another very simple question. What was Joseph and Mary's hometown? If you read Luke, it was Nazareth. If you read Matthew, it was Bethlehem. In conclusion, it's undoubtedly true that the Gospels of the New Testament do contain stories about Jesus that are historically accurate. But they also contain stories that appear to have been modified as Christians told and retold the stories over the decades between Jesus' death and these first accounts of their life. One of our tasks will be deciding which of the stories in the Gospels represent historically accurate materials and which ones represent stories that have been modified in the process of the retelling. Our first task, though, will be to look at the Gospels themselves to see what they have to say about Jesus, to see what their perspectives were. We'll begin that task in the next lecture, starting with the first gospel to have been written, the Gospel of Mark. We've seen in our study of the Gospels to this point that these accounts represent not only genuine historical recollections of what Jesus said and did, but also stories that were modified, sometimes modified significantly, sometimes slightly, as people told and retold the stories about Jesus. Since the Gospels have both kinds of tradition in them, both historically accurate accounts and accounts that have been changed, we have two fundamental tasks before us as we engage in our study of these texts. First, we have the task of looking at each account as a piece of literature to see what its own take on Jesus was, what its own perspective on Jesus was. Secondly, we'll have the task of getting behind the portrayal of Jesus in each of these accounts to see what Jesus himself was really like. I look on these as the literary and the historical tasks of the historian. We'll begin with the literary task, devoting a lecture to each of the four Gospels of the New Testament, and then a lecture to Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament. After we've looked at each one individually for its literary portrayal of Jesus, then we'll be able to move behind the accounts to reconstruct what Jesus himself actually said and did. To engage in the literary task of studying the Gospels, it will be important for us to consider the distinctive emphases of each account. There's not just one Gospel of the New Testament, but four. And as we'll see, each of the four has something special to say about Jesus. Because these four differ, sometimes in slight ways, sometimes in major ways, it's important that we take them on their own terms. If we conflate the four into one gospel, then we destroy the distinctive meaning of each one. This can be seen by any interpretation of the Gospels that takes two accounts that has discrepancies and mashes the two accounts together so that then you have one account. Sometimes people speak, for example, of the 7 last words of the dying Jesus. These 7 last words of the dying Jesus come from taking the 4 Gospel accounts in which Jesus says things while being crucified in different Gospels, putting them together so that Jesus says all 7 things. The problem is that each of the Gospels records a specific idea about Jesus in the things they have him say at the end, so that when you put all 4 of them together, the distinctiveness of each account is lost, as we'll see in subsequent lectures. At this point, I simply want to stress that we need to consider each of the Gospels on its own terms, without appealing to other Gospels to help us explain the Gospel that we're trying to study at any point. We're going to begin our study with the first Gospel to be written, the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is attributed in Christian tradition to a man named John Mark, the personal secretary of the Apostle Peter. As I indicated in the last lecture, we don't actually know who this author was. The attribution to Mark does not occur until 70 or 80 years after the book itself was actually written. All we know about this author is that he was a relatively highly educated Greek-speaking Christian who was writing some 35 to 40 years after the events that he narrates. Most scholars date this book in the late 60s AD, 65 possibly as late as 70, possibly a few years even after that, 35 to 40 years after Jesus' own death. This author appears to have heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation for some time. He then wrote down a number of these stories, not simply as he heard them, but putting his own spin on who Jesus really was. I'll continue calling this author Mark simply for the sake of convenience rather than choosing some other name out of the hat. Mark begins his account of Jesus by calling his book a gospel. The very first verse of the book, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The term gospel comes into English through the Old English Gospel, which means good news, a direct translation of the Greek word euangelion, good news, the word we get evangelist or evangelism from. It's worth pointing out that Mark calls this book a gospel rather than, say, a biography. Mark doesn't claim to be writing a historically accurate biography in the modern sense of the term. Instead, he claims to be writing an account of Jesus that reveals how Jesus' life and death brings good news to those who are willing to receive it. In particular, as we'll see, this book was written not simply to recount events from Jesus' life, but to explain to the readers who Jesus really was and why his death mattered. Mark sets a tall order for himself at the very outset of his gospel by this initial description of Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, chapter 1, verse 1. These descriptions may not seem particularly problematic or surprising to us today because Christians today naturally think of Jesus as the Christ. But for people in Mark's world, this description would have seemed rather shocking. The term Christ is a Greek term which literally means anointed one. In fact, it is the exact Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Mashiach, Messiah, so that the Greek Christ means the Hebrew Messiah. This is a designation or a title, not a name. I need to emphasize this with my students, my undergraduates, because they don't realize that Christ isn't a name, but I have to tell them that Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name. It's not Jesus Christ, born to Joseph and Mary Christ. It means Jesus, the Messiah. Why would this have been a surprising or problematic designation for Jesus? Well, precisely because of what people thought the Christ or the Messiah was supposed to be. This would have been a shocking description of Jesus in the ancient world, precisely because everyone, Mark, his readers, and everyone who wasn't his reader, knew that Jesus had been crucified as a criminal. But Jews were not expecting a crucified criminal as the Messiah. Quite the contrary. Those Jews who were expecting a Messiah, and I doubt if most Jews were, but many Jews possibly were, those Jews who were expecting a Messiah were expecting a figure of grandeur and power, that is, a great military leader, someone like King David of old, or a cosmic figure who is going to come from heaven in judgment against the earth, the forces of evil that are now in power. Jews who expected a Messiah thought this would be a powerful figure who would overthrow God's enemy and set up God's kingdom on earth. So far as we know, there were no Jews prior to Christianity who thought that the Messiah was going to be somebody who was crucified. In fact, the Messiah was not supposed to suffer and die. The Messiah was supposed to overthrow God's enemies and so bring in God's kingdom. Jesus, on the other hand, was obviously crucified. How then could he be the Messiah? Mark's book is designed to show how Jesus could be the Messiah despite the fact, or rather, more shocking still, because of the fact that he was crucified. For Mark, Jesus was the Messiah because he suffered and died. Mark begins his narrative through a series of stories that are meant to demonstrate Jesus' credentials as the uniquely authoritative Son of God. You begin reading this gospel and you are immediately struck with the authoritative character of Jesus. Jesus is first announced by a Jewish prophet named John the Baptist, announced as the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, Mark chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. John baptizes Jesus. Jesus, immediately after being baptized, goes off into the wilderness where he does battle with the devil and the wild animals, returning from the wilderness unscathed. He immediately begins his public ministry by acting in ways that reveal his great power. The early accounts of Jesus here in chapter 1 of Mark are meant precisely to show that he is a man who has God's authority behind him. The first thing he does is he calls some disciples. He walks along the Sea of Galilee and he sees there two brothers, Simon and Andrew, fishing. And he calls to them, saying, "Come follow me, and I will make you fish for people," or more traditionally, "I will make you fishers of men." Immediately, these men who've never laid eyes on Jesus before drop their nets and follow him. Right afterwards, Jesus sees two other brothers fishing, James and John. And again, he calls to them. They leave behind their father, Zebedee, in the boat along with the other workers, and they drop everything to follow Jesus. Jesus calls people and they follow without asking questions. This is showing his authority. He not only is an authoritative leader, he is also an authoritative teacher. Jesus, we're told in the next two verses, teaches the crowds and they are amazed because he teaches as one who has authority. His authority is not only over people that he leads and over people that he teaches. Jesus has authority even over demons and illness. We're told in the next stories that Jesus casts out demons, evil spirits that inhabit bodies. Jesus has authority over them. He casts them out, and people are amazed because of his authority. He then heals people who are sick, so much so that people come from all around. There's no room even before the door. He heals all those who are sick. These stories in chapter 1 of Mark are designed to portray Jesus as the authoritative Son of God. His commands are heeded by all. He teaches with unparalleled authority. He has power even over the demons and over human illness. You would think that with all of these miracles, people would recognize Jesus for who he is. One of the striking points of Mark's gospel, which makes it stand in contrast with other gospels, is that in fact, in this gospel, virtually nobody recognizes Jesus despite the miracles that he does. Consider, first, how people react to Jesus in this gospel. Of course, there are people who are being healed by him. They must know who Jesus is. People are seeing him do miracles. They must know who he is. What does Mark tell us about how people understand Jesus? Well, in fact, it's quite striking. Virtually no one understands Jesus' identity, especially in the first half of this gospel. Chapter 3, verse 21, we're told that his family comes to seize him from the public eye because they think that he's gone out of his mind. His own family. I should point out that in this gospel, there's no account of Jesus being born to a virgin in Bethlehem. This gospel begins with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. So there's no account here of Mary knowing anything about Jesus before his birth. You think, yes, but that she did know about it because of Matthew and Luke. But remember, we have to read each gospel on its own terms. Mark's gospel is written to people who don't know Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke hadn't been written yet. If you're reading this gospel and sticking to this text, in this book, his family thinks that he's crazy. Not just his family. We're told in chapter 6 that people from his hometown don't understand what he's doing, since to them, he's simply the carpenter down the street. He's been delivering these fantastic teachings, and people come and they're amazed. Who is this? This is the carpenter. How does he teach such great words? Even though he grew up with them, they don't understand who he is. Not just his family and his townsfolk, even the leaders of his own people don't understand who he is. Jesus casts out a demon, and people are wondering, could this man be the Messiah? The Jewish leaders, though, insist, chapter 3, verse 22, that the reason he's able to cast out demons is because he's empowered by the prince of demons, the devil. The Jewish leaders think that he's inspired by the devil. Most striking of all, Jesus' own disciples are explicitly said not to understand who he is. In two accounts in this early part of the gospel, the first half of the gospel, we have accounts of the disciples who've witnessed what he's done, fail to understand who he is. And their narrator explicitly tells us that they don't understand. One time he is on the boat, and a storm has come up, and he says to his disciples to beware of the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees. They think, oh, this means that we should have brought some bread along, because Jesus has been talking about leaven. And they feel, well, you know, we blew it this time, we didn't bring any bread on the boat, and he's upset with us. This is right after Jesus 2 times has multiplied loaves of bread for the multitudes, feeding 5,000 at one time and 4,000 another time with just a few loaves of bread. The narrative ends when the disciples think, oh, we should have brought some bread along, by Jesus saying, don't you yet understand about the bread? I can provide bread. No, they don't understand. A couple of chapters later, in chapter 8, we have another account of the disciples explicitly being said not to understand who Jesus is. Chapter 8, verse 21, Jesus has just performed another miracle, and again, the disciples are questioning among themselves what this is all about, and Jesus has to ask them, don't you yet understand? The answer is no. They don't understand. Throughout the first half of this gospel, virtually nobody understands who Jesus is. Well, surely somebody understands. Jesus has been doing all these miracles. Who does know that Jesus is the authoritative Son of God? When you read through the first half of this gospel, you might be surprised at who knows about Jesus' identity. In fact, you can count the people who know about Jesus' identity on one hand. The narrative begins, as I've indicated, with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. It's an interesting account. It's not narrated in any great depth, but we are told that when Jesus is baptized, he comes up out of the waters, and immediately as he comes up out of the waters, he sees that the heavens split apart, and the Spirit descends upon him in the form of a dove, and a voice came from heaven that says, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." The voice comes directly to Jesus. You are my Son. It doesn't come to the crowds around Jesus, as it does, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew. Who knows that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, number one, God knows because he says so at the baptism. Number two, Jesus knows because he's the one who hears the voice. Number three, interestingly, the demons know who Jesus is. When Jesus casts out demons in this account, they fly out of the bodies of the people they've been inhabiting, and they cry out, "You are the Son of God," chapter 3, verse 15. The demons know. Who else knows? Well, Mark obviously knows because he's writing these things, and you know because you're reading them. But no one else seems to know who Jesus is in this account. Halfway through. All of that does change at the midpoint of the gospel. Mark shows that, in fact, people progressively begin to have some inkling of an understanding of Jesus' identity halfway through this gospel. At the halfway point of the gospel comes probably the most interesting miracle story of the entire narrative. It's an account of a man who is blind, who only gradually regains his sight. I take this account to be a symbolic expression of what will happen to Jesus' disciples, who only gradually come to see who Jesus is. The way the story goes is this man who's been born blind is led to Jesus. Jesus is asked to heal the man. He spits in the ground. He spits, and he uses the spittle to put on the man's eyes as a kind of salve. The man then is asked, "Can you see?" And he says, I see people walking around, but they look like trees. Now, it's not quite clear what that means, how the man would know what trees walking around would look like if he had been blind. But I think the point is that he sees in a fuzzy way. He doesn't see clearly. And then Jesus, at a second stage, looks at him intently, and the man then begins to see. This is the only gospel story in which Jesus is unable to heal somebody immediately. It takes place in stages. And it takes place right after the disciples are said not to understand who Jesus is. I think it's a symbolic story of the stages through which people go as they come to see Jesus' real identity. I think this in part because of what happens in the next story. Jesus is with his disciples and he says to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They say, "Well, some say that you're John the Baptist come from the dead. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're another prophet." Jesus says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter, the leader of the disciples, replies, "You are the Messiah." Chapter 8, verse 29. Now you would think, well, okay, somebody finally understands. Somebody now gets it that Jesus is the Messiah. But it's interesting what happens next. Jesus then warns the disciples not to tell anybody. Not to tell anybody. Why would Jesus want them not to tell anybody? Is it because, for this gospel, Jesus is not the Messiah that anyone expected him to be? That he's not the great and powerful figure who's going to overthrow his enemies? Interestingly, Jesus begins to teach that he has to go to Jerusalem to suffer and die. It's the next words he says. He has to go to Jerusalem to suffer and die. Peter rebukes him for saying this. After all, how can the Messiah suffer? If you're the Messiah, how can you suffer? Jesus then, in turn, rebukes Peter, telling him that he doesn't understand yet the truth about himself. Jesus is the Messiah for Mark, but he's the Messiah who has to suffer and die, even if no one else recognizes it. From this point in the narrative, Jesus regularly predicts that he needs to suffer and die. He makes 3 predictions of his coming passion. In this context, by the way, a passion prediction. Passion in this context, as I tell my students, doesn't refer to what happens in the dormitories on Friday night. Passion in this context comes from the Greek word pascho, which means to suffer. The passion of Jesus is the suffering of Jesus, the narrative of his suffering and death. A passion prediction, then, is a prediction of this coming death. On 3 occasions, Jesus predicts his coming death. Mark chapter 8, verse 31, chapter 9, verse 31, and chapter 10, verses 33 and 34. What is striking is, after each of these predictions, the disciples demonstrate their complete inability to understand what Jesus is saying. They spend their time talking about who among them is the greatest and who will be the most powerful in the coming kingdom. After each prediction, they engage in this kind of dialogue. They don't realize that Jesus is not going to overthrow the Romans. He's going to be crushed by them. And following him means experiencing his fate. Mark's gospel has sometimes been called a passion narrative with a long introduction. Fully 6 of the 16 chapters of this book deal with the final week of Jesus' life. leading up to his death. After 10 chapters of teaching the multitudes, healing the sick, casting out demons, and even raising the dead, Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the Passover. He spends then a week there preaching in the temple. He has a last meal with his disciples, after which he's betrayed by Judas, arrested by the authorities, denied by Peter, put on trial by the Jewish leaders, and then brought before the Roman governor Pilate, who condemns him to die on a cross. Then comes the climax of the narrative, the point at which everything else has been driving up to this stage, Jesus' death itself. Up to this point, no one seems to have recognized who Jesus is. And even those who, like the disciples, have some kind of partial understanding of Jesus have not fully realized that even though he's the Messiah, he needs to suffer and die. At the end, it seems that not even Jesus himself is so sure. 3 times he prays that God will remove this fate from him, as if the Messiah could escape suffering. At the end, he's completely silent, as if in shock. As he hangs on the cross, he has been silent throughout the entire proceeding. Everybody has mocked him, and at the end, hanging on the cross, he cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" He then dies. Even if Jesus has doubts at the end in this gospel, though, the reader does not. Mark gives 2 clear indications in the very next 2 verses what this death was all about. Mark chapter 15, verses 38 and 39. The first thing that happens when Jesus dies, we're told that the curtain in the temple is torn in half. This was the curtain that separated the area of the temple called the Holy of Holies from everything else. The Holy of Holies was a room in the temple which was the most holy of rooms because it was thought that that was where God's presence dwelt on earth. No one could go into that room except once a year. The high priest could go in the room to perform a sacrifice for the people before God. Mark says that curtain is ripped in half, meaning that now God is no longer separated from his people because of Jesus' death. The death of Jesus brings salvation. This is a death that had to happen. Moreover, the second thing that happens is that somebody recognizes it. No one throughout this entire gospel has realized that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, who has to suffer until the end. Interestingly, it's not one of Jesus' family members or townsfolk, not one of the Jewish leaders, and not even one of his disciples. It's the pagan centurion who has just crucified him, who sees him die and then calls out, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Jesus is the Son of God in this gospel, not despite the fact he died, but because he died on the cross. His identity is then finally confirmed at the end of the story. 3 days later, Jesus' women followers go to the tomb. They find it empty. There's a man there who tells them that he has been raised from the dead. Interestingly, in keeping with the theme that Jesus was completely misunderstood all along, we're told that the women then flee the tomb and don't tell anyone about it because they were afraid. The original version of the Gospel of Mark ended there, with the women not telling anybody anything. At a later time, in the early Middle Ages, some Christian scribes who copied the Gospel of Mark added an ending to this account, 12 verses, in which Jesus actually does appear to his disciples, convincing them that he's alive. Scholars, though, are convinced that this additional ending to Mark's Gospel was not original. The disciples never did understand, even though the reader does. Let me sum up in conclusion the major points I've made about this Gospel. Mark was the first Gospel to be written by a Greek-speaking Christian who had inherited a number of traditions about Jesus. This author doesn't simply repeat these traditions to provide us with historically accurate detail about what Jesus said and did. His account is in fact much richer and more nuanced than that. Mark molded his traditions to make his point that Jesus was an unexpected Messiah, one whose suffering and death were neither accidental nor incidental to his messiahship. For Mark, Jesus suffered and died precisely because he was the Messiah. Moreover, Mark wants his readers to know that if they expect to follow Jesus, they too must take up their cross and follow him. In our next lecture, we'll consider the Gospel of Matthew and see in what ways its portrayal of Jesus is similar to and different from this account of Mark's, the shortest and earliest of our New Testament Gospels. At this point in our study, we've begun to examine the individual Gospels of the New Testament to see how they each portray Jesus. Our assumption has been that each Gospel is distinctive and that it's important to see how each author individually portrays Jesus. We began with Mark, since by common assent it was the earliest of our Gospels to be written. Mark portrays Jesus as the powerful but almost universally misunderstood Son of God, who despite common expectations had to suffer and die. We can now move on to Matthew, a gospel widely thought to be the most Jewish in its understanding of Jesus. In many ways, both Matthew and Luke are very similar to Mark. In fact, there are entire passages that the three Gospels share, sometimes telling the very same stories, word for word, the same. For that reason, scholars have long called these three books the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic comes from two Greek words which mean seen together. It's possible to lay these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, side by side and see them together. They tell many of the same stories, often in the same words. As we'll see, this is not the case with the Gospel of John, which has very few stories in common with the other three. For centuries, scholars have agreed that the Synoptic Gospels have so many stories in common because they used the same sources for their information about Jesus. The reason they tell the same stories, the reason these stories are sometimes word for word the same, is because they're all using the same sources. More specifically, it's now generally thought that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark available to them, and that they borrowed many of the stories that they give, stories of their accounts, from Mark, changing the stories as they deemed desirable. And so the stories are often told in the same sequence, but sometimes Matthew will relocate a story to another part of the gospel, or Luke will do that, or sometimes they'll change the words. So that often the three Gospels agree with one another. Sometimes two of the Gospels agree against the third, and sometimes all three are different, depending on who changed what. Matthew and Luke, though, have a number of stories in common between themselves that are not found in Mark. Obviously, for these stories, Mark was not the source. For the most part, these traditions involve sayings of Jesus. For example, the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Scholars now generally believe that these stories found in Matthew and Luke, but not Mark, come from a gospel document that no longer survives, which scholars since the 19th century have called Q. The Q document is a hypothetical source, in other words, it no longer exists, scholars have to reconstruct it, that provided Matthew and Luke for many of their traditions about Jesus, especially their sayings material. The document is called Q because the scholars who devised this theory in the 19th century were German scholars, and they called this special source for Matthew and Luke somewhat lacking in ingenuity, they called this source the source, which in German, of course, is Quelle, spelled with a Q, and hence they simply give it the short designation Q. And so when people talk about the Q source, they're referring to this hypothetical source of Matthew and Luke. For stories that Matthew and Luke each has that are unique to its gospel, scholars posit yet additional sources. Usually they simply call Matthew's special source or sources M, and they call Luke's special source or sources L. And so, for example, Matthew alone tells the story of the wise men following the star to the baby Jesus. That would have then come from M. Luke alone tells the story of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, both parables found only in Luke. That would come from L. As a result, behind our three synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the opinion of most scholars, there were four sources, only one of which we still have: Mark, Q, M, and L. Since it appears that Matthew used Mark as one of his sources, one of the ways to study Matthew's gospel, and Luke's as well when we get to Luke, is by seeing how it differs from its source. This is a way of studying the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that is sometimes called redaction criticism. Redaction criticism tries to look at how an author has redacted or edited his sources. And so if Mark was one of the sources, we can see how Matthew has changed Mark. The idea behind redaction criticism is that if an author liked the way a story already was, he wouldn't have changed it. If he's added something to it, taken something away from it, or changed its wording, then it's because there's something about the story that he wanted to change. So by looking at the changes, you can see what the author's vested interests were. That's the approach we'll take in this lecture toward the Gospel of Matthew, trying to see how Matthew differs from Mark in order to see what Matthew's distinctive emphases were. By way of background, let me remind you that this Gospel has been attributed traditionally to Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, who is known to be a tax collector. We don't actually know what the author's identity was. He doesn't appear, though, to have been an eyewitness to Jesus' life. As I've pointed out earlier, this book is written anonymously. There are no first-person narratives in this account. And if scholars are right to say that this author used Mark for many of his stories, it's hard to imagine that the author himself was an eyewitness, as if he had to rely on somebody else for recounting what Jesus had done when he had seen it himself. For these reasons, scholars are fairly unified in thinking whoever the author was, he was not one of the disciples. He appears to have been a Greek-speaking Christian, living around 80 or 85 AD, about a half century or so after the events that he narrates. Matthew's Gospel provides a distinctive portrayal of Jesus. On the one hand, as you might expect, Matthew has a similar view to Mark. Here too, as in Mark, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, whose entire life looked forward to his death, which was necessary to bring about salvation. Matthew has many of the same stories and therefore much of the same theology as Mark. But there are different emphases in this gospel as well, as becomes apparent at the very outset. In brief, the distinctiveness of this gospel has to do with its stress both on the Jewishness of Jesus and on his opposition to Judaism as he found it. This gospel emphasizes far more than Mark that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. He gathered Jewish disciples and taught them that they had to follow the Jewish law. At the same time, Jesus opposed the Jewish teachers of his own day and condemned the way that they practiced their religion. It's this combination of a strong affirmation of Judaism, as it ought to be, and a vitriolic condemnation of Judaism as it actually was practiced that makes Matthew's portrayal of Jesus so distinctive. Matthew's emphasis on Jesus' own Jewishness can be seen in passages that are found in Matthew that are not found in his earlier source, Mark. Let me stress again this methodological point. By adding stories to his source, Matthew has altered somewhat the overarching perspective. We saw that Mark began his gospel with the baptism of Jesus by John. Matthew doesn't begin his gospel that way. Instead, Matthew begins his gospel with a genealogy that traces the descent of Jesus. Now, genealogies are not among the most favorite reading of most students of the Bible. Who begat whom? I have to assure my own students, though, that the genealogy in Matthew, which is only 16 verses long, doesn't compare at all with some of the genealogies you get in the Hebrew Bible. First Chronicles, which begins with 9 chapters of genealogy, is a lot more names. Here, though, simply 16 verses that are well chosen verses because the names in this genealogy are a key to Matthew's own emphasis, as becomes clear at the very beginning. Matthew's gospel begins with a verse. The book of the generation, or the genealogy, of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He begins his gospel by stressing the intimate connection between Jesus and David and Abraham. David, of course, was the great king of the Jews who lived 1,000 years before Jesus, the great king whose descendant was supposed to be another king, a ruler of the Jews, commonly known as the son of David, the Messiah. Abraham was the father of the Jews, from whom all Jews trace their lineage. In other words, this very first verse is stressing that Jesus is Jewish, descended from Abraham, and that he's the Messiah, descended from David. The genealogy itself goes on then to establish Jesus' credentials as standing in the messianic line of the Jews. And it does so in a striking way. The genealogy begins, Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers, and then it goes on down to Jesse begot David the king, David begot Solomon, the son, through the wife of Uriah, Solomon begot Rehoboam, etc., and it goes on down to Jeconiah, who was begotten along with his brothers by Josiah at the time of the captivity to Babylon. After the captivity to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Salathiel, Salathiel begot Zerubbabel, etc., on down to Mathon, who begot Jacob, Jacob who begat Joseph. Joseph was the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. In other words, it's who begot whom from Abraham to David, to the captivity in Babylon, down to Joseph, who was married to the woman who begot Jesus. It doesn't say that Joseph begot Jesus. But then comes the most striking verse of all, verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. Those from David to the captivity in Babylon were 14 generations. And those from the captivity in Babylon to the Messiah were 14 generations. 14 generations between the father of the Jews, the great king of the Jews, the Babylonian captivity, and the Messiah. This genealogy seems to be showing that at every 14 generations, a significant event happens in the history of Israel. Its greatest king, its greatest disaster, the Babylonian captivity, and then its Messiah. 14 generations separating all the key events in the history of Israel. This sounds almost too good to be true, as if the Messiah had to come precisely when Jesus was born. The problem, though, is that in order to make this sequence of 14, 14, and 14 work, Matthew has had to do some creative editing. A comparison with the Hebrew Bible shows, in fact, that Matthew has dropped out some of the names from his genealogy. Chapter 1, verse 8, where Asaph begot Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat begot Joram, and Joram begot Uzziah. According to this, then, Uzziah was the son of Joram. But when you read the Hebrew Bible, 1 Chronicles, the 9-chapter long genealogy and Chronicles, if you dig through there, you will find Joram and Uzziah again. But in that case, it turns out that Joram was not Uzziah's father. He was his great-great-grandfather. Why would Matthew change the genealogy that he inherited from 1 Chronicles? Apparently because he wanted to show that something significant happened at every 14 generations. If he included all the generations between Joram and Uzziah, then he would no longer have the 14 sequence. There are other problems with this sequence of 14 names, one of which being that the final sequence of 14, in fact, contains only 13 names. Matthew, though, is trying to make a point, and the point is not really about the historical accuracy of his genealogy. The point is about Jesus. He's trying to say that Jesus really was the Jewish Messiah descended from the venerable Jewish line of David. His genealogy is constructed in order to show that there was divine providence behind the appearance of Jesus at this particular point in time. Jesus' Jewishness continues to be at the forefront in the stories that come next in Matthew's Gospel. Stories that, again, are not found in Mark. Stories of Jesus' miraculous birth. Probably the most striking thing about these stories, as found in Matthew, is that they mirror the accounts of the birth of Moses in the Hebrew Bible. Now, let me remind you what I said at an earlier lecture, that you can compare the accounts of Luke and Matthew about Jesus' birth because they both give narratives of Jesus' birth. But the accounts are very different from one another. The stories found in Luke are not the stories found in Matthew, and vice versa. In Matthew's account, there's no word about Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, taking a trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem because there's a tax that Caesar Augustus has levied and the entire world has to go register for a census, and so it just happens that weekend they're in Bethlehem. There's no account of that in Matthew. In Matthew's Gospel, Mary and Joseph just are in Bethlehem and Jesus is born there. There's no account in Matthew's Gospel of the shepherds coming to worship Jesus. In Matthew's account, there are no shepherds. Instead, there are the wise men who come to worship Jesus. The way the story goes in Matthew's Gospel after the genealogy is that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. There are wise men who are following a star who eventually come to Bethlehem, apparently some months later, because we find out that King Herod learns that these wise men have come, and he decides that he wants to kill this child who has been born. And so he sends his soldiers out, and they kill every child 2 years and under in Bethlehem. Well, why 2 years and under? If Jesus was just born last night, surely the soldiers would recognize that some toddler in the yard running around wasn't born last night. It's because these wise men, in fact, have taken months to come to Bethlehem. Joseph learns in a dream, though, that Herod is sending out the troops, and he's warned to flee, so they flee to Egypt. We're told they flee to Egypt so that God can fulfill a scripture about Jesus. Out of Egypt have I called my son. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. When Joseph and Mary learn then that Herod has eventually died, they return. Where are they going to return? In Matthew's Gospel, they want to return to Bethlehem, presumably because it's their hometown. But they learn that the ruler now in Bethlehem is Archelaus, Herod's son, who's even worse than his father, and so they decide to relocate in Nazareth. And so the reason Jesus is raised in Nazareth is because his parents have to relocate there after fleeing back out of Egypt. These stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew, unlike in Luke, are interesting because they mirror the accounts of Moses. In Moses, too, a child is born under a hostile regime, Egypt rather than Rome. In Moses' case as well, the ruling power wants to destroy him. In Moses' case, too, he's divinely protected. He sojourns in Egypt. He leaves Egypt. He goes through the water. In Moses' case, of course, it's the water of the Red Sea during the Exodus. In Jesus' case, immediately after the stories of his birth, he's baptized. In other words, it skips all those years between his infancy and his adulthood. The next story, though, is he goes through the waters of baptism. And then he goes out into the wilderness to be tempted, just as Moses and the children of Israel go into the wilderness. For 40 years, Jesus is 40 days in the wilderness. And then Jesus comes from the wilderness and goes up onto the mountain to deliver his teachings, his new law, just as Moses went up on Mount Sinai to deliver God's law. My point is that Matthew has told the stories about Jesus' birth precisely in order to call to mind the birth of Moses. Why the birth of Moses? Because for Matthew's gospel, Jesus is a new Moses, a new Savior of the people of Israel, not one who stands in contradiction to or in tension with Moses himself, but a new Moses who fulfills the law of Moses and delivers its correct interpretation. Matthew doesn't understand the choice for people in his day to be between Moses and Jesus. Matthew, as we're going to see, is not propounding that followers of Jesus have to reject Judaism. On the contrary, followers of Jesus, according to Matthew, have to affirm Judaism. But it's Judaism as interpreted by Jesus. It's not a choice between Moses and Jesus. It's a choice between Moses without Jesus or Moses with Jesus. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, it's only Moses with Jesus that is the proper interpretation of the law of Moses itself. Some people have pointed out the striking fact that in Matthew's Gospel, unlike Mark and unlike Luke, in Matthew's Gospel there are 5 major blocks of Jesus' teaching, the first of which is the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. This material, much of it is not found in Mark. Most of this material comes from Q. But why are there 5 blocks of his teaching? Is it to form a parallel to the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch? It's a possibility. It's important further to recognize that these stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew's Gospel are all explicitly said to fulfill the Scripture. We're told by Matthew that Jesus was born of a virgin, and we're told why. Because according to Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child, and you shall call him Emmanuel. There's question, of course, whether Isaiah itself was referring to the birth of a child through a virgin. When you read the text in Hebrew, in fact, it doesn't say a virgin will conceive and bear a child. The Hebrew says a young woman will conceive and bear a child, but the Christian quotation of it in Matthew indicates that she was to be a virgin. Jesus' birth fulfills Scripture. He's born in Bethlehem. Why? Well, Matthew says because it's according to the prophet Micah, who says that the Savior will come from Bethlehem. He flees to Egypt. Why? Because as I've indicated, Scripture says, Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, out of Egypt have I called my son. At every point, the events in Jesus' birth are said to fulfill Scripture. Why this emphasis found in Matthew and only in Matthew? Precisely because Matthew is trying to show that Jesus fulfills everything God predicted in the Scriptures. Jesus, in other words, is the Jewish fulfillment of the Jewish law given by the Jewish God. He's the one who, like Moses, will deliver God's law to his people. This emphasis on the law that Jesus gives is particularly found in the first block of his teaching, the so-called Sermon on the Mount. Jesus goes up on a mountain, much as Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and then delivers his teaching. He begins the Sermon on the Mount not by espousing an entirely new teaching, but interpreting for his hearers the teachings of Moses in the so-called antitheses. The antitheses of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew. The antitheses are the beginning, partway through after he's given the Beatitudes, where he begins to interpret what Moses said and then gives his own reading of what Moses means. Jesus says, for example, you have heard it said that you shall not murder, and that whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who gets angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, you should not even lust after a woman in her heart. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, turn the other cheek. Jesus gives a law of Moses and then gives his interpretation of the law of Moses. These teachings are called antitheses because Jesus sets his own understanding of this teaching in opposition to other understandings of the teaching. It's not that Jesus is contradicting what Moses himself said. In other words, Jesus doesn't say, Moses said you shall not murder, but I say you should. These antitheses instead are giving alternative interpretations of the law of Moses, which get beyond the literal level, down to the point of the spirit of the law. Moses said, don't kill. I say, don't even get angry. Moses said, don't commit adultery. I say, don't even lust. Jesus wants his followers to follow not only the letter of the law, but its very spirit. Some readers have assumed that Jesus can't really be serious. Jesus can't really expect people not to get angry or not to lust. I should say, though, that Matthew, in fact, seems to think that Jesus is quite serious. Matthew gives no indication that he thinks that these are impossible commandments. Quite the contrary, Matthew indicates that Jesus' followers are to keep the law even better than the Jewish leaders of his own day. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, found only in Matthew, don't suppose that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not even a small part of the letter, will pass away from the law until it all takes place. Whoever looses one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do likewise will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Then he concludes by saying, truly I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus insists that his followers keep the law and keep it even better than the scribes and Pharisees. Well, how is that possible? Matthew evidently does not think it's possible simply by making a detailed list of do's and don'ts that everybody has to follow. To some extent, following the law of God for Matthew is a very simple affair, as we learn later in the Gospel in chapter 22, where a Jewish teacher comes up to Jesus and says to him, what is the heart of the law? And Jesus quotes two of the law's commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Anyone who truly follows those two commandments fulfills the law and does so better than the scribes and the Pharisees. In fact, in this gospel, the emphasis on following the Jewish law and the emphasis on the Jewishness of Jesus himself is counterbalanced by Jesus' forceful opposition to the Jewish leaders, whom Jesus does not think follow the law very well. In fact, Jesus portrays them as hypocrites who demand that people follow the law but don't do so themselves. Particularly striking is chapter 23. Chapter 23 of Matthew shows Matthew's vehement opposition to the scribes and the Pharisees, where Jesus calls his opponents, the Jewish leaders, whitewashed sepulchres. They're clean on the outside, but filled with rot and corruption within. He calls them hypocrites who don't practice what they preach. He says that they stress what is picayune. They don't keep what is central, but try to keep little bits of the law. They strain at gnats, but they swallow at camels. They're portrayed as godless and heartless blind leaders who know the right thing to do, but don't raise a finger to do it themselves. Matthew's gospel has sometimes been thought of as being anti-Semitic because of this harsh opposition to the Jewish leaders. I should stress, though, that there's nothing in this gospel itself that condemns Jews per se, only Jewish leaders. Even in the most vitriolic attack, Jesus does not condemn Jews per se. Probably the most poignant scene is at Jesus' own trial before Pilate, where Pilate claims that Jesus is innocent and he washes his hands of Jesus' blood, found only in Matthew. The Jewish crowds cry out, "His blood be upon us and our children." Some people have taken this as a condemnation of the Jewish people, but it's worth noting that in the context, it's the Jewish leaders that have urged the people to say this. It's the Jewish leaders who are at fault for leading the Jewish people astray. This gospel does not condemn Judaism or Jews. It condemns the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day. In conclusion, this gospel is a lot like Mark. Here too, Jesus dies as the Son of God for the sins of the world. But the emphasis here is a lot more on the Jewishness of Jesus. Jesus here is the Jewish Messiah sent from the Jewish God in fulfillment of the Jewish law. Jesus, as the Messiah, gives the true interpretation of the Jewish scriptures to his Jewish followers, and he expects these followers to keep the Jewish law even better than the scribes and the Pharisees.